The cigarette smoke chokes me, but I don't let myself cough. Instead, I keep it inside. Everything in me wants to let it out, expel it like some kind of poison disagrees with my organs. Still, I keep it inside. It's my first cigarette ever, in a classroom far away from the populated part of the school. I won't let myself look like a wimp, not in front of her. I couldn't give a crap about the popular kids standing with us in the room. I've never felt the need to care about them. However, when I heard the girl of my dreams was going with them, I just had to be there. That's pretty much how I found myself here. No one goes here anymore. Not after that kid died. Honestly, it was kinda sad. Some poor little girl gets lost and ventures into a neglected and dangerous part of the school on her own, on her very first day at that, and has a large table fall on her and injure her pretty badly. Then, slowly, she loses her life as she bleeds out. You'd expect there to be an outcry of some sort, yet the school pushes the blame onto the parents and bashes them. The local paper joins in, and before you know it, the whole town is bullying this family about not teaching their child proper safety rules. A 7-year-old girl was supposed to be taught proper safety rules. It sounds as ridiculous as it actually is. What do we get from all this? We get lectures on how we, as students, should keep the younger students safe. We get ghost stories that quickly spread across the school about the young girl and how she can still be heard crying. We get a special assembly today on the 1-year anniversary of her death, an assembly where we have a moment of silence for her. But don't worry, guys, refreshments are provided. Seems like everyone around here is an insensitive bastard. I pause my thought to find Alicia looking at me. I take another deep pull off the cigarette I'm holding. I take it better this time. I still feel the need to cough, but not as intense as before. Is this what romance is worth? Because as my brain gets cloudy and I drown in nicotine, it seems worth it. That is when the crying starts. I almost didn't hear it at first. It was soft, but definitely audible. I turn around, but there's nothing. We all start looking around. Have we been caught? None of our teachers would make that soft a sound if they caught us. Must be a small animal. Then it dawns on us all at once, and a nervous chuckle takes over the room. It can't be the stories about the dead girl. It just can't. It's probably just someone playing a prank on us. Still, the whole group slowly but surely creeps towards the door. No one admitting they're scared, but everyone ready to run at the same time. I take another pull off the cigarette, then I hear another cry. It's time for us to go. However, a thud behind us makes us turn around, and then a slam behind us makes us turn around again. Something distracts us, something in the dark of the room, just long enough for us to turn away from the door, long enough for it to slam shut. We're all trapped now. Everyone's scrambling, trying to open the door. The cool kids are still nervously chuckling, thinking it must just be the wind. However, the wind can't close a door hard enough for it to feel like it's been welded to the door frame. We can't get out of the room. That's becoming clearer now. You see, the thing about the light and the dark is that you can see in either one. The other just has to be absent. As the door blocks out the light from outside, the room inside becomes clearer. The dark corner is now taking shape. There's a desk there, a large, heavy one, and underneath it is a small frame. It looks like a doll, but it's faintly moving. It has to be a child. I'm not an idiot, not by any means. I'm a skeptic, definitely, but not an idiot. I'm seeing a ghost live out its last moments, a child live out her last moments. The cigarette is on the floor now, and so am I. We've all fallen to the floor, unable to move. I look around me, and it seems like we've been pinned by an invisible force. It sounds ridiculous, but it makes sense. A force more powerful than our meek bodies can handle. She's not living her last moments. We're living her last moments. I feel like I'm about to die. I'm not ready for this. I'm too young. I just want to go home, to see my family. I just want to go back to class. I was so excited to see my friends today, to be around people who I care about. All things that she must have thought about. All things I'm thinking about now. I turn my head, and she's in the corner, sobbing. A child with nowhere to go, and no one to help her. Yet she keeps asking for help. I can't die here. I hope she gets help. I hope I get help. That's when I realize she never got help. And maybe neither will I. We're all going to die here, and I'm terrified by that thought. But I'm not the one I should be afraid for. My life, as scared as I am, doesn't matter. I should be helping the one that looks at me and sees me as someone older, someone who could have helped her. I turn to her and look in her eyes, into the eyes of the dying child, and speak to her. It's going to be okay, I say to her. It's all I can say with the weight on my chest. It's all I need to say. She stops sobbing and looks at me, almost as if she trusts me. I wish I could help, but I can't. The weight is now off my chest. Every one of us is able to get up. Every one of us is able to leave. And so is she. She disappears. I hope that it knows that wherever it's going to be okay. Outside the school, emergency services are waiting. Apparently, the same thing happened to every single person in school. They didn't see the ghost, but they did feel pinned down. Authorities are blaming it on a gas leak from years of neglect by the people in charge. When I hear that, I start to chuckle. I wonder who they're going to pin the blame on this time. My third week working at Hals found me shoveling harpy crap. The filthy birds use their horrifically scarred, twisted, and just generally unattractive human heads to hurl insults at me as the sweat dripped down my face. Clearing this particular cage was always rough, as the dirty hybrids took a great deal of joy in trying to add to the mess faster than I could clean it up. The poop cart was halfway full of dung, having already cleaned out the unicorn, the chupacabra, the thunderbird, and the yeti cages. I'm not sure exactly what bizarre combination of chemistry and magic was happening, but somehow the scent that emanated from the cart reminded me of a quality chicken parmesan. "Hey, human, like that smell? Want a taste from the source?" screeched Blanche from high above me. The four disgusting creatures laughed raucously and started lobbing down additional work for me to enjoy. Rose fluttered down to stare at me, before heaving a little more vitriol and trying to spit directly at my face. I swung up my pitchfork to block, the spittle immediately sizzling through one of the tines and dripping to the straw-covered floor. Rose, if you ruin my equipment, I'm going to head back to the thrift shop, and you can spend the next week swimming in compost. She snorted at me and flapped her way back up to her perch, where her sisters sat chortling. I slipped back on my headphones to drown out the screeching vitriol and continued with my chores. Internally, I reminded myself I was still in my training period, which, much like any of my previous jobs, mostly consisted of doing all the work that Butch didn't want to do. Still, though, I thought, as I used the remaining part of my pitchfork to lift another load of rancid harpy crap, this was better than working at Denny's. Despite the instinctually unpleasant nature of the cleanup, I genuinely enjoyed spending time in the menagerie. 10-year-old me had loved the idea of cryptids, so getting the opportunity to crawl into a large pen and cuddle with a couple of dozen jackalopes was kind of a dream come true, not to mention the weekly poker games with the centaurs. I had doubled my first paycheck when I realized they were incapable of understanding the concept of bluffing. Half an hour later, and I could finally walk across the harpy cage and actually feel the firmness of the floor beneath my feet. Exhaling explosively, I pulled the wheelbarrow out of the cage, locked the door behind me, and leaned tiredly against the bars. I allowed my eyes to wander around the store as I tried to will my muscles into relaxation. Much like the thrift store, the menagerie seemed to have been organized by an utter madman. Large beasts were housed next to tiny ones, predators next to prey, those capable of speech housed across from those who just roared or screeched. The only exception was the largest animals, dragons, mammoths, the bipolar cyclops, etc., who were all held by the far west wall where the ceiling was highest. A soft bell rang as a customer entered, and I stabbed the pitchfork into the pile of waste and pulled off my headphones. I began walking towards the front to make myself available. Behind me, Dorothy made a comment on my backside that would have been flattering from anyone else and sent another bomb through the bars to splatter at my feet. I was fully prepared to launch into a formal retail greeting, but my words caught in my throat as I saw who had entered. Dark hair, full lips, green eyes that pierced through every defense I possessed, a low-cut blouse that presented a couple of very convincing reasons to break eye contact. The woman's beauty was otherworldly. Actually, considering the nature of most of my clientele, otherworldly was probably more literal than literary. She smiled at me, and I forgot my standard greeting, my name, and had to breathe. "Hey there, new guy," she purred softly. "King illegal forest to pigs wild kill in it as I responded wittily. She blinked. Well, that's a new one. "Excuse me for a moment." I turned and walked over to the barrel full of coconut rum I had prepared to feed the rougarou and dunked my head in, taking in a few large mouthfuls. I re-emerged, dripping cold and a little queasy from the taste. "Let me try that again," I said. Nothing like a full immersion in alcohol to help talk to a woman way out of your league. "Hello, welcome to Hals Low-Cost Menagerie. My name's Clear. How can I help you?" The woman smiled broadly. "I must say, you handled that better than most men. A lot of things get easier once a guy embraces his own idiocy. What brings you in today? Ingredients? Food? Companionship?" "I actually just needed to have a word with Butch. Is he around?" Butch should be covering the counter in the thrift store. If you wanted to look around for a bit, I can run and grab him for you." "Maybe in a minute. It's been a long time since I've been in this part of the shop." She stepped forward and looped her arm through mine. "And since this is the section I walked into, I think the shop wants us to get acquainted." Goosebumps rose instantly on the part of her arm that touched mine, which immediately brought up a twinge of nervous suspicion. Butch had insisted that I reverse my monkey's paw wish, quite understandable of the opinion that fear was absolutely necessary to keep oneself from doing something idiotically reckless in an environment like Hals. He worked on the wording of the wish for a ridiculously long time to restore my fear, allowing me to function while afraid without crapping my pants, and to avoid any comically ironic twists. It seemed to work out pretty well, although I had noticed that the more scared I became, the more I would impulsively make sardonic comments. Butch didn't seem to notice that part, probably since it fit my personality like a glove. I led the distractingly beautiful woman through a dark maze of cages, allowing her to direct the duration spent admiring each of the animals. She'd obviously been around the mythical block a few times, since she barely seemed impressed by some of the more commonplace residents like the Chimera or the Jersey Devils. She hurried past the harpy cage as the four of them immediately began to harmonize in a repetitive chant of "Whore!" But she did fall instantly in love with the three-headed quokkas. Brushing off my warning, I had seen a few of them breathe fire. She released my arm and climbed directly into the pen with them, lying down and allowing them to curiously climb over her while she laughed delightedly. "Oh, I love these! What are they?" "They were just discovered a few weeks ago. We decided to call them Chalamets." Chalamets? "Yeah, 'cause they're cute, but also kind of off-putting." She laughed again as one of them began to shimmy its body down the front of her blouse. I sternly told myself that it was ridiculous to be jealous of a rodent. The woman rose gracefully back to her feet, the Chalamet still nestled comfortably between her breasts. Two of the heads were sticking out of the top of her shirt, looking about gleefully. The third seemed to have fallen asleep against the swell of her cleavage. Lucky little jerk. "I guess I've been chosen," she declared, climbing carefully out of the pen. "This little guy's coming home with me." "The pets pick the owner," I agreed. "We can get you checked out in the thrift shop if you still needed to talk to Butch, Miss Babs." I was incredibly confused for a moment because the voice that spoke her name was not the dulcet music she had used before, but rather a masculine and gruff, gravelly one. It seemed to be coming from behind me, too. Butch was standing next to the Kelpie stalls. His curious scowl had descended into a disgusting grimace. Babs gave him a smile of her own that would have lit up a cemetery, but Butch didn't soften so much as a werewolf's hair. "I thought we agreed that it would be best if you stayed away from the shop," Butch said, his voice dangerous. "I thought that was more of a suggestion. I didn't think you'd actually trespassed me." "That suggestion was based off the assumption that you didn't want to see me anymore, that I wanted to see you." "Butch, come on, don't be like that. It's been what, 50 years since the last time we saw each other? Think for a minute. Would I stay away that long only to show up now if it wasn't important?" "Why do you have a Chalamet between your tits?" Babs crossed her arms across her chest protectively. "Even someone like me needs an emotional support animal, Butch." "Get a harpy, then. You'd have more in common." "I knew it was you who got them to call me that." I started laughing uncontrollably, Butch and Babs pausing their fight to stare at me. "Butch, you absolute rascal. You never told me you used to be married." "It's not often that you get to witness an actual miracle, so I made sure to relish every second that I was able to see Butch blush." Babs suddenly became very occupied, scratching a basilisk behind the ears. My shit-eating grin stayed on my face as I forced a big hug on Butch. "Man, she is way too hot for you. What, are you actually rich or something? Is this the part where I ask for a raise? Oh, hang on. Was it a physical thing? Wait here, I'll go get a ruler." Butch pulled away angrily. "Clear, is there any way I can convince you to just not be yourself right now?" "Not a chance, DeMarco. You know I have a terminal case of not knowing when to shut up. So..." I sat down on the wheelbarrow full of dung and leaned back comfortably, my stomach growling at the smell. "How did you two meet? Also, Babs, does that mean you're single?" The look Butch gave me was disgusted. I returned it with an impish grin. "You really have no concept of appropriate, do you, Clear?" We work in a second-hand shop. This is kind of what we do." Butch sighed, and Babs tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile. "I think I like this one, Butch," she told him. "Yeah, you would. Maybe you should just tell me why you're here. I'm not sure I have the energy to play around today." "Well, that sounds familiar. Babs, come on." Babs' grin flickered a bit and fell. "Butch, Hal's been hiding out at my place for the last few months. He went missing yesterday." Butch's face didn't change, but he did fall silent. Babs seemed to be silently pleading with him to hear her out, and he was obviously considering it. Finally, he glanced over at me. "Clear, I think we need a couple of minutes. The Becks just got in with a new shipment. Will you go sign them in and restock, please?" There were times to joke, and there were times to leave people to their conversations. I had a hard time telling the difference sometimes. Well, most of the time. But I had learned that when Butch asked politely, it was probably for the best to just follow his lead. I nodded silently and made my way to the elevator at the back of the menagerie. In the elevator, I took a moment to consider the whole conversation I'd just witnessed. Hal had been staying with Butch's ex-wife. That actually made a lot of sense. I knew Hal and Butch had been pretty famously tight, so the last place anyone would expect Hal to go would be to Butch's ex-wife. What did that mean for Babs? Butch was one of the most formidable people I knew, but even he had spoken of Hal with a bit of awe. If Hal went to Babs for protection, God only knows what she must be capable of. Honestly, it probably meant she was exactly my type, i.e., a really bad idea. No, I wasn't really going to try to hook up with her, tempting as the thought might be. But she did strike me as someone who would play along with my attempt to get a rise out of Butch. I shook off the thought and pressed the TC button on the panel. I felt the lurch in my stomach that was slowly becoming familiar. My hand instinctively reached out to brace myself against the wall as the tiny room began racing off to the left. That surprised the hell out of me the first time I'd ridden this thing. I tried to figure out how any of it was possible at first, but pretty quickly decided I liked not having a migraine anymore. The elevator entered its cruising speed, so I placed my hand on the other wall to prepare for the equally jarring de-escalation. While I waited, my eyes scanned down the button panel again. There were 6 of them. Well, 9 if you counted the door open, door close, we're all gonna die buttons. Besides the TC, where I was going, and the M, from where I had just been, there was also an FD, or Fine Dining Restaurant, LH, Love Hotel, and one that actually managed to fit in BOSEC, the Blood Orgy Suite and Event Center. The final button was at the bottom, and it just said D. Butch hadn't told me what that one went to, just to never go down there unless Satan himself was on my tail. I decided that it was prudent to take him at his word on that one. I felt my weight shift towards my bracing hand. I tried not to think about how far I had traveled in the last 3 minutes. I hadn't stepped outside from the menagerie exit yet, but I knew the restaurant opened just outside Brussels, and that trip only took about 1:30. The elevator ground to a halt, and the doors opened on the thrift store. No customers, fortunately. Butch had assured me that stealing from the place was impossible, but even in the supernatural realm, customers became pissy when you made them wait. The Becks were not customers, though, so they just had to put up with waiting. 4 of them stood next to the front counter, 3 boys and a girl. A pallet with several layers of boxes was floating about 6 inches off the ground next to them. As usual, their faces were identical and expressionless. Their blonde hair was cut in the same early Beatles bowl cut. Their eyes were the same deep black voids. "About time, asshole," the tallest of them grumbled. It always amused me that despite their appearance, they always sounded like middle-aged teamsters. "Deepest apologies, my tallest," I intoned mournfully, while dipping into a florid bow. Standing back up, I slipped back into my normal speech. Seriously, though, I'm really not. I was watching Butch meet up with his ex that he hasn't seen in 50 years. Believe me, totally worth it. The tallest snorted. Babs is back, huh? That poor guy. She had centuries of experience manipulating men like him. Hey, I'm still new here. This was the first time I'd heard of her. You guys want to fill me in on some backstory? The girl shook her head. Not our business, kid. We deal in inventory, not gossip. Union rules. Nothing wrong with a little idle conversation, Munchkin. Call me that again and you'll lose a finger. I believe you, short stuff. Come on. I just want to know how large a pile of shit I'm standing in. Another of the boys blew out a breath. Look, we really don't pay much attention. She was here a lot, and then she wasn't. I know she worked for meth, so she spent most of her time down in the restaurant. I blinked in surprise. Didn't see that coming. Whatever, I'm pretty sure most of us have a past we're not so proud of, and working in the restaurant would make sense if she was on meth. The tallest spoke again. Quit thinking like an idiot, kid. Meth. Monsters for the ethical treatment of humans. Babs used to make sure the people they served down in the restaurant were treated humanely and that they didn't suffer unnecessarily during the slaughtering process. Oh, well, nice. She struck me as the humanitarian sort. Any idea why they split? Butch's old assistant kept on jokingly flirting with her, so Butch killed him. Oh, really? No, not really. Now will you please sign this damn paperwork so we can get back to work? I grabbed the outstretched clipboard, signing my name at the bottom, and handed it back. The tallest tore off the receipt copy and handed it back to me. The four of them walked in lockstep out the door as I turned to begin the unloading process. Curious as I was about what Butch and Babs were talking about, I had to admit that this was my favorite part of the job. Paperwork identified this as an estate sale procurement, which meant a 50% chance of it being junk or awesome. The Becks were pretty good at picking out items of significance, but a well-loved children's toy or a serial killer's trophy collection had a tendency to set off the same alarm bells with them. I was met with disappointment for the first 8 boxes. Well, mostly. I did find myself spending an inordinate amount of time studying a fascinating painting of what appeared to be a Soviet-era army marching across an ocean with the silhouette of the Golden Gate Bridge barely visible in the background. A pod of fish painted with the Soviet flag swam around the advancing army's feet. I decided to hang it behind the cash register so I could study it more at depth later. There was definitely something to it, since it took every ounce of concentration I had to pull my eyes off of it. I struck gold on the 9th box, where I found a translated copy of the Voynich manuscript, an unabridged version of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, 12 missing books of Homer, one of which was titled The Time Achilles and Odysseus Totally Boned, a strange red hat that smelled like sulfur-flavored ambergris and looked like it was perpetually covered in sand, and a small bow complete with arrow-filled quiver that all appeared to be plated in gold. Pulling out one of the arrows, I noticed they seemed to be quite intentionally phallic. I quickly double-checked everything in the box off the inventory list the Becks had given me and set it aside for Butch to set prices. I found a few other decent items scattered through the rest of the boxes, but I handled them myself, due to us having very similar items already in stock. Mass-produced grimoires, a few decks of tarot cards, a couple of haunted toys, a number of enchanted pieces of clothing, things like that. At the bottom of the final box, since that's how these things always go for some reason, I found trouble. The moment I picked up the forest green book that said "Hi Clear," written in Comic Sans on the front cover, I knew there was no way anything good could come from it. But of course, I immediately said, "Hi, book, nice to meet you," and opened it. The first line of the first page simply said, "Ha, you idiot," and began to glow red hot in my hands. I dropped it since I had completely ignored the Masha requirements of protective equipment when handling untested magical artifacts. On the floor, the book flipped its pages towards the center and began to emit a bubble of green light. God damn it, I yelled, and quickly ran behind the counter to grab a bag of salt that we keep for situations like this. I managed to get a circle drawn around the book just before the bubble burst, and a giant, hideous, praying mantis-looking thing flew directly at me. It hit the barrier with a dull thud, looked down at the circle of salt, and hissed audibly. I let out an audible breath as my heart pounded in my chest. It twisted its arms and waved them in front of its face, immediately transforming into a woman with short red hair and piercing eyes. The wings stayed, though, flapping softly to keep her aloft as she looked down at me in a contemplative way. "Release me!" she whispered, fiercely. I stared back at her, wanting to think she was cute, but unable to get her insect form far enough out of my head to consider it. "I know there is much we can learn from each other if we can negotiate a truce. We can find a way to coexist. Can there be peace between us?" "Peace? No peace! Release me now!" Man, Butch said you guys didn't have a sense of humor, but you just rolled with that one straight away. "Rolled with what, human? I said release me this instant." Wait, you mean those screenwriters actually came up with a realistic dialogue for that scene? Huh, who would have thunk it? She threw up her hands. "Why must I always be caught by humans who make no sense?" "I think that may say more about you than me, sweetheart." The yellow door at the far end of the shop burst open then, and a tall, lanky fellow covered in red-brown fur casually strolled out. "Jack!" I yelled enthusiastically. As far as I knew, nobody had laid eyes on him since he disappeared through that door on my first day. Jack sauntered over to me and gave me a fist bump before clapping me on the shoulder with camaraderie. He glanced up at the fairy briefly, who bared a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth at him. He flipped her off in return. "Where you been? Butch told me you'd be okay, but I was starting to get a little bit worried." Jack reached into a pocket of fur and withdrew a small business card to hand over. It said, in a small typeset, "The Back Rooms." I flipped it over to see a small description of the itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny, multiversal in-betweeny. "Yep, that definitely clears it all up." He grinned at me. "Well, let me buy you a drink down in the restaurant before you head out tonight. I definitely owe you one." He nodded at me. Then he shot a questioning look at the fairy trapped in the circle of salt. "No idea. Butch told me about how to trap her, but not what to do with her after. Any thoughts?" Jack shrugged and fired a finger gun at her. "That's a thought. It's iron rounds for fairies, right?" Since I had no idea where Butch kept the iron bullets, it was probably for the best that he chose that moment to come through the elevator door. "What's all this, then?" he asked, taking in the scene with a bewildered look. "Jack!" yelled Barb from behind Butch with delight. She ran towards him and launched herself into a surprised embrace, burying her face in his fur. The Shalamet squeezed out from between them and scrambled up on top of Jack's head, chittering in annoyance. Ever so slowly, I watched as Jack and Babs began to lose balance and tip backwards. It probably would have resulted in everyone sharing a good-natured laugh at their expense, if they hadn't fallen directly onto the circle of salt. The Fae wasted no time, flipping straight back into praying mantis mode and flying straight at me. I managed to duck underneath her before the impact, but her back talons managed to swipe against my raised forearm, drawing a thin line of blood. She quickly made for the front door, but a quick shout of, "Hey Siri, set my Fae protection wards," from Butch blocked her exit with a crisscross of bright purple lines. She spun on us furiously, her face darting around the shop for another way out. Babs and Jack were pulling themselves back to their feet, but Butch was already in action, running through an aisle with his hands deftly swiping items off the shelf. "Clear! Get the salt ready!" Sensing that he was probably the largest threat in the room, the Fae went for Butch next. He slid to a stop at the end of the aisle and stood his ground. When she got close enough to him for Barb to let out a yell of concern, Butch reached into his pocket and threw a cloud of powder into the air. It must have been iron filings or something, because she immediately shrieked and started trying to claw at her own face. Butch moved in closer, an iron bar in his hand ready to finish her, but one of her flailing wings caught him in the head and sent him sprawling. She shook her insectile face, and her reddened eyes fell on me standing in front of the cash register, holding the bag of salt. Jack and Barb came at her from either side, but a powerful flap of her wings sent them flying. I stared dumbly at her as she began racing straight at me, her face filled with rage. I looked around helplessly for anything within reach that might help me in this fight. The Chekhov's gun was too far away. Nothing nearby was made of iron. Really, the only thing within reach that might work was, I grabbed the painting of the Soviet army walking on water and held it up between me and the charging foe. The impact never came. I lowered the painting just enough for me to look over the top and saw her examining the painting while tapping her chin thoughtfully with her long, thin tarsi.
Interesting. Is this intended as a Cold War propaganda piece? If so, which side is it for? A warning for the West or an aspiration for the East?
I'm not sure, I replied, calmly walking around the counter and pretending to contemplate the painting while surreptitiously beginning to reform the salt circle around her. I thought at first that it might just be a depiction of some kind of Orwellian future, but now I'm starting to wonder if it's something way more insidious.
This might actually be an original Alexander Somakov, she said, fascinated.
I don't actually know. We just got it in. I haven't had a chance to get it officially appraised yet. If you're interested, though, we might be able to make a deal. I stepped back and sprinkled the last bit of salt in the bag onto the completed circle. With a quick motion, I reached over and pulled the painting away, breaking her line of sight. Dismay filled her eyes as she looked down and realized that she'd been trapped again.
"Fuck me,"
she groaned. Sorry, really not interested when you're still in that skin. If you want to switch back to the redhead, though, we could talk about it, I'm sure. The fairy shot me a dirty look, but shifted to her human form anyway.
"If that is the cost of freedom, then I will do what I must."
Ew, no, I was kidding. Sorry, I've got many perversions, but formicophilia is not on that list.
How do you know what it is called, then?
I really don't have an answer for that. I Google random things when I'm bored.
Then name your desire, human, and allow me to return to my realm.
Butch, Barb, and Jack had joined me around the circle at that point, and the two former lovers were exchanging a pointed look. Weirdly enough, kid, your screw-up might have unexpected benefits here. Barb and I were just coming to talk to you about it. Actually, we need to track down Hal. This shop is in some serious trouble if the Hellspawn managed to get a hold of him. He was safe over at Barb's, but now that he's vanished, we really need to do something about it. He looked over at the trapped Fae. How about that? Can you bring Hal back to us?
You did not trap me, shopkeeper. My deal is not with you.
Butch looked at me.
All you, kid. Think you're ready to go solo?
I smiled at him. I was born ready. It was pretty satisfying that I even got Jack to let out an exasperated groan with that one. All right, babe, what do you think? Can you bring Hal back to us? The fairy's eyes were distant.
No, he has been shielded against interference by fairy magic. I don't know how, but I cannot touch him.
Well, shit. How about information? Can you tell us anything about him? She nodded.
3 questions, 3 true questions, and you will give me my freedom.
Fine, but no BS answers, okay? No technically true, but only because homonyms exist answers, and nothing so cryptic that it only makes sense after we're done. You got me? Also, once you give us the answers and I break the circle, you can't hurt any of us for trapping you. Understood?
Agreed. I will speak only the full truth, and we shall all depart unharmed.
All right. Where's Hal? What's the quickest way for us to get to him, and what will we need to do in order to successfully find him and bring him back? She closed her eyes briefly, as if scanning her hard drive.
He is currently hiding in Purgatory. The blue door at the back of the shop will bring you to the realm, but then you take the subway to Terrace 5 and catch the bus to the historic district. Once there, you must have with you a servant of heaven, a denizen of hell, and a man perpetually trapped in the mortal realm. Between the four of you, you should be able to track down a social media influencer who goes by the name Razamataz, who will guide you to Hal. I cannot tell you whether you will be successful in convincing him to return. The uncertainty that surrounds him is too deep to see clearly, but all other paths lead to certain failure. Bear in mind, these instructions are intended for you alone. If these others decide to leave you behind, these answers may no longer be truthful.
All right, that'll have to do. Thank you, gorgeous, I said, and broke the salt circle with a foot. The fairy immediately vanished with a crack of lightning. The four of us looked at each other for a moment.
That was uncharacteristically straightforward of you, Clear, Butch said, sounding slightly impressed.
The whole screwing up the 3 questions trope's been done to death. I don't think there was anything I could add to it, so I didn't see the point. Well, strangely enough, we have most of our group already, Babs commented. All we need is a servant of heaven. Wait, really? Is Jack from hell? No, but I am, Babs replied. My place is located in one of hell's suburbs. And the man trapped in the mortal realm? Butch held up his hand.
Right here. I will be answering no follow-up questions.
He looked over at Jack.
Hey, bud. Glad you made it back okay. Any chance you'd be willing to keep an eye on the shop for a few days while we go drag the owner back?
Jack raised his hand and rubbed his thumb and forefinger together.
Of course. I'll give you double what I'm paying Clear.
Wait, what the hell? I yelped.
Shut up, Clear. You're still in training. Is that cool, Jack?
Jack gave him a thumbs up.
Super. So, all we need to do now is track down the servant of heaven, and we can get started.
Right on cue, the front door opened, and a fat, middle-aged man walked in, naked except for a drooping sash. He had a toothpick sticking out of the front of his teeth, and a tiny pair of soft white wings sticking out from his shoulder blades. "Hey, dudes, I just talked to a bunch of creepy kids who said you all might have my bow," he said with a lecherous smile. A wide grin spread across my face. "I think we might have what you're looking for, but technically speaking, it's our bow now." His face began to turn angry, but I held up a calming hand. "Let's not get off on the wrong foot here. I'm sure we can make a deal. I'm Clear, by the way. It's good to meet you." He accepted my outstretched hand.
"You too, I suppose. I'm XMac."
My grin grew 3 sizes that day. "Of course you are. Hey, anyone else hungry? I'm starving. Let's hit the restaurant before we get started." I had to hand it to Hal, I thought, as our motley crew settled into our table at Hal's low-cost fine dining and exotic foods. He really had managed to corner an extremely niche market. It made me think of that old story of Michael Jackson renting out an entire grocery store and populating it with his own people so that he could experience what it was like to be a normal person going grocery shopping. If you were a Lovecraftian horror from an alternative dimension with a taste for human souls, I would imagine going out for dinner and drinks at a restaurant with your friends was an experience you were rarely able to enjoy. I had been in the restaurant a few times since the beginning of my employment, but it was mostly just in and out for restocking purposes. One time it was to help chase down a zombie who was trying to do a little dine and dash. Well, dine and shuffle. Badoom-tsh. But this was my first time actually dining here. If one were to disregard the clientele, They could almost believe there was nothing overly special about this particular eatery. That was, until they sat down and began to actually examine their surroundings. The decorative artwork existed in the same banal subgenre found in an average chain Italian restaurant. Bland and forgettable scenes of idyllic European wineries. Except the woodpile at the side of the living quarters was composed of bones, and there seemed to be a decapitated body lying next to the stump, decorated with an axe, standing at a 45-degree angle. Portraits of a happy family in a sunny kitchen, usually chopping the fingers off a dismembered arm. One painting, towards the entrance to the kitchen, was of a scared-looking man who seemed to be frozen midway through pounding on the canvas in an attempt to break his way out. There were only about 30 tables in the restaurant, but they were spread far apart to accommodate diners of all sizes. Of those 30 tables, only 6 of them were occupied. 3 by seemingly normal humans, if not for the noticeable blood splatter around their plates. A large gelatinous blob relaxing contentedly on another corner, with a full-sized human slowly digesting inside of him. Another held a minotaur and a gorgon who gazed at each other with hunger, though whether it was for sex or dinner was impossible to tell. At the final table sat Satan in all his red-skinned, spiral-horned, cloven-foot glory. He seemed to be completely engrossed in his copy of Atlas Shrugged. My eyes lingered on Satan for a bit, wondering if the traditional neutrality of the restaurant had been taken a little too far. As a result, I jumped a little in my seat when the waiter spoke behind me. "Sir, would you like to sample the house wine?" I turned around and locked eyes with a pair of dead ones that stared back at me. The vampire looked young, maybe 18 or 19. His hair had that way too greasy look that all vamps seem to have. His gaunt skin looked almost as if it had been stretched over his skull, and his canines bulged out grotesquely from his mouth. His gaze seemed to drip hate, probably at the world in general, but it certainly felt like it was directed at me personally. I will never in a million years understand why people thought vampires were sexy. "Sure, Sparkles, pour one out," I responded. The vampire grimaced and proceeded to pour a taste of deep red wine for me. "Aged 50 years, notes of oak, lavender, and brunette." I blinked at the last one, feeling a sharp tingle down my spine, knowing that it meant what I thought it meant. This would be a line I hadn't crossed yet. Butch watched me from the corner of the table, his eyebrows cocked as if curious of what I would do. I met his eyes and downed the glass. Still a trainee, my ass. I'm not sure exactly what this fact says about me, but I found the wine to be excellent. It's delicious, but I probably couldn't afford the bottle, not when Butch is paying me half what he's paying the temp. Just a virgin daiquiri for me. The bloodsucker nodded and moved around the table, taking everyone's drink orders. Babs gently nudged me and whispered, "The waiter you just called Sparkles is Gwade, the eldest son of the ruling vampire family in Europe. He's over 600 years old." I looked at her with a slight smile. "Butch just admitted he's stuck on the mortal plane," I whispered back. "How long have you been stuck here?" "About 500 years, I think. Last week, I called him a non-Tesla pigeon fucker. For me, Sparkles is downright polite." Babs gazed at me thoughtfully. "You know, I'm putting the odds on about 50-50 for whether your personality is going to take you far in this lifestyle or get you killed in the next week." I shrugged. If I'm gonna be killed, I want to feel like I deserve it. Hey, if Sparkles is a prince, then what the hell is he doing working here? No idea. He would never talk about it. My guess is he, or his dad, owes Hal a favor. That's how most people end up working here. Not me, I said. I volunteered. Yeah, but you're pretty fucked in general, right? Fair point. Butch glanced up at us. I think you two whispering together might actually be the most terrifying thing in this restaurant.
Don't be jealous, Butch, I quipped. You know you'll always be my bae.
He rolled his eyes at me and turned back to XMac. I hate to admit it, but I think you're the first Cupid I've ever met, too.
I'm not surprised, XMac said, while helping himself to a piece of bread from the center of the table. You don't really strike me as the one-night stand kind of guy.
Babs was occupied with pouring a little water onto a saucer for her three-headed quokka, so she didn't see the glance Butch sent her direction.
I guess not. What's that have to do with it, though? Aren't you basically a heavenly matchmaker?
XMac squinted.
More like a divine eugenicist. When it's destiny for two people to bump uglies and push out a kid, they send me in.
Well, that's a bit disillusioning, Babs commented. You don't inspire love, then?
XMac laughed. When you hear stories about Cupid, how does it go? He fires an arrow at a couple of unsuspecting people, they run to each other and immediately start making out and dry humping each other. Does that sound like love to you? Sure, in the old days, once a few periods were missed, there was a pretty good chance they'd get married, and sometimes love would grow from that pairing. But that initial can't keep your hands off each other feeling, that's us, and that's pure lust, sugar tits.
Gwade returned with our drinks. I wasn't sure what satanic bar they had poached their mixologist from, but the daiquiri was incredible. I quickly scanned the menu when I realized that Gwade had started taking food orders. Despite my experimentation with the wine, I wasn't ready to go full cannibal yet. Unfortunately, that eliminated most of the menu for me, so I went with the plesiosaur sushi. Babs and Butch started to bicker about his choice of Arrhythmian boar, her claiming that he needed to start watching his blood pressure, and him arguing that he was functionally immortal. While I listened to their banter, I began to feel the prickling sensation of eyes studying me. I looked across the restaurant and found myself locking eyes with Satan. He had closed his book and was contemplating me from across the table. After a moment of us staring at each other, he tilted his head towards the door to the kitchen. He then stood up and casually strolled in that direction. At some point, I was really going to have to examine why I felt the compulsion to do the most recklessly irresponsible things. Because when most people see the devil attempt to lure them into the back of a restaurant that serves humans, their response is to run the other way. My response was to mutter something about going to get another daiquiri and walk right into the kitchen after him. I waved hello to the chef, a giant millipede who had handled a dozen different saucepans at once, and to the sous chef, a large hairy man with giant tusks sprouting downward who was garnishing a person's crushed head on a silver plate surrounded by kale and sprouts, and a Middle Eastern man wearing a full tool belt who was sawing through a human arm with a handsaw. I gritted my teeth as I continued past the kitchen and into the pantry area. Although one wall of the large pantry contained all the normal professional kitchen ingredients, the other wall was lined with stacked cages filled with terrified-looking people who immediately started begging me for help. I wasn't so jaded yet that I didn't feel that shock of horror and the feel of guilt as I tried to keep an impassive face. Morality becomes far more complicated once you understand your true place on the food chain.
"Shut up!"
growled a voice at the back of the pantry, and the cages went quiet.
"What the fuck are you doing here, Clear?"
"Three things, Satan," I began, holding up three fingers. "One, how do you know my name? I know I'm kind of a big deal around here, but I didn't think the news of my exploits had gotten as far as your ears yet. Two, thinking about putting out a petition to rename this place the Monster Mash. What do you think? Three, I know you're the essence of pure evil and all that, but Ayn Rand? Seriously?"
Satan laughed. "I completely forgot that from your perspective we haven't met yet, but believe me, we're old friends."
"I dunno, feel like I would remember something like that."
"How about now?"
Satan vanished. Simultaneously, I felt a slight pressure on my left shoulder. I turned my head to see a tiny version of Lucifer standing there.
No, really, Claire. You don't need to feel bad about pushing that kid off the swing. You told him you wanted a turn 10 minutes ago. It's fine, Claire. She's a nice girl. You don't need to wear a condom with her. It's only Walmart, Claire. Everybody shoplifts from Walmart once in a while. Don't worry about it. Claire, everybody already expects you to drink the blood wine.
The weight from my shoulder disappeared, and the devil-looking guy popped back into the full size in front of me again. You're my shoulder demon?
That's a bingo.
We just say bingo around here. So you're not the real devil then?
Nope, just your personal Jiminy Locust.
Hey, can you do one-handed push-ups?
Can you hold a conversation that's not 80% movie references?
Now, I repeat,
what the fuck are you doing here?
Waiting for my Nessie sushi. Why? Think I should have gone with the dragon roll instead? My demon stared at me.
It's amazing that no part of you needs my encouragement to constantly make shitty jokes.
If you're my shoulder demon, then you should already know I only started making bad jokes so that I could stop crapping myself instead.
And the next time I catch him alone, I'm gonna slap Butch full in the face for that. Anyway, just wanted to have a quick face-to-face with you. Make sure you actually know what you're doing and you want to do this.
Shouldn't there be a shoulder angel having this talk with me?
He quit when you were 19. He's running the AA meetings on the third circle now.
Jesus, am I really that hard to work with?
Yeah, look, I agree, this is out of your bailiwick, but this isn't the kind of descent into bad decisions I'm used to. This rabbit hole goes deep, Claire, deep enough that even I have concerns about where we'll end up. You're close enough to the entrance that you can still climb back up, get back to a normal life. We can get one of your old jobs back, find some hottie to settle down with, get a house with a man cave where we can get stoned and bang the babysitter after the kids go to bed. Trust me, it'll be a fair shake better than where we could end up if you go through that door to purgatory.
I stared at my shoulder demon in horror.
Claire, you gotta calm the fuck down. You're drunk.
Am not, I shouted as I filled my pockets with the iron powder Butch had used a few hours earlier. I had been lost in an existential dread throughout the remainder of dinner. We just need to get going right fucking now, and I want to be prepared. I've never been to Purgatory before. I've never even been to Florida. Purgatory's like Florida, right? I feel like I heard that. Butch shrugged.
No, not at all. But also, yeah, kinda. It's still not so bad that you need to bring Excalibur.
I paused in the process of clumsily strapping the huge sword across my back before letting it clatter back to the ground. Yeah, you're right, we need a low profile. I'll take the Cloak of Cowardice, I said, pulling the black supervillain cloak off a shelf and flourishing it over my shoulder.
Seriously, Claire, what the hell has gotten into you?
I don't want to work at IHOP again, I yelled, my panic infusing my voice with more volume than I intended. A sharp slap echoed across the store. I looked to the far end of the store to see Babs stalking away from a broadly grinning XMac.
What? Come on, it was a compliment, he shouted after her.
Babs walked up and glared at me. We really had to recruit the first angelic being that walked through the door, didn't we? I know we can do better than a Cupid. Look, I know he's a little Weinstein-y, I sighed, but the fairy was only able to tell us where Hal was at the particular moment we asked the question. He could already be gone for all we know. Babs shook her head. Fine, but one of you two needs to go talk with that guy. If I have to spend the entire trip hearing about his ideas for tattoos I should get across my chest, I'm going to feed him to a rancor. I looked at Butch. Do we have a... It's an idiom, you idiot, Babs snapped at me. Give me a break. It's only been a few weeks since I learned that every other thing was real. Why did we put you in charge of this again? It
It was my animal magnetism, wasn't it?
Kid, get the Cupid off my tits.
I grunted. Fine. Butch, go deal with the pervert angel. I'll get us packed, he told me. I nodded and made my way over to XMac, who was thumbing through a copy of Hustler. He glanced up at me. Don't worry, I'll behave myself going forward. Just like, starting the bar off low. It's the best way to continually exceed expectations. Believe me, I understand that philosophy better than most. He grinned at me. I can always tell a kindred spirit. Same. I never thought it would be a Cupid, though. I never really thought about what you guys would look like in reality, but I don't think I expected... I gestured to all of him. At Butch's polite request, XMac had decided to spare us his traditional sash and overtly chubby nudity. I was still on the fence about whether the neon green velour jumpsuit was actually an improvement or not. If I'm gonna be hanging out in some other people's plane of existence for a while, I'm doing it in style. Is velour all the rage in purgatory these days? He raised an eyebrow at me. First time? I'm still pretty new to the lifestyle. Should I be worried? XMac gave me an appraising look up and down. My hands seemed to recognize his gaze and instinctually moved to cover my crotch. Don't flatter yourself. I like my guys with a little more meat on their bones. I'd maybe consider that cloak before we go. It won't really look out of place, but gets pretty hot during the day. I swept my cloak off, Nosferatuically. I need a plan B in case things go sideways. Also, don't I look awesome in this thing? Vintage vampire might be the new look. You drunk kid. Why does everyone keep asking me that? You were with us at the restaurant. You saw everything I had. You had 4 daiquiris. Virgin daiquiris. There was an extended pause. Those were regular daiquiris with virgin's blood in them, weren't they? Makes much more sense now that I know you're a noob. Nothing fucks you up quite like virgin's blood. I tried to quell the queasiness that washed over me for a moment. I reconsidered the cloak. I had already done far more vampiring that day than was probably healthy for me. If you two are done blowing each other over there, Babs said, hefting a backpack over her shoulder, I don't have enough time for a detour to heaven to replace Katniss Everhard over there, so we definitely don't have time for you to go mining for prostates. Butch looked up from his inspection of Chekhov's gun and grinned at her. Don't take this the wrong way, but I kind of missed how crass you get when you're impatient. He slipped the gun into the waistband of his pants and looked over at us. She's right, though. You guys all set? I walked back to the counter and pulled the Soviet painting off the wall, making sure to keep eye contact directly with it. I think I'll bring this along, I said, as I pulled off the frame and rolled up the manageable tube. It has a comes-in-handy feel to it. I slipped the tube into the pack Butch had prepared for me. A quick glance inside showed a couple of sandwiches, a few religious relics, a set of brass knuckles, handheld crossbow, and a big bag of weed. I pulled out the weed, not complaining, but is this really necessary? We may need to bribe our way through at some point, Butch explained. I replaced it and slid the backpack back on. I'll take your word for it. The purple door at the back of the shop opened, and Jack popped his head out. He reached out a gnarled, clawed hand and pumped it up and down a few times. Plunger's under the sink, Jack, Butch told him. Probably be gone by the time you get out. You all good in here for the next couple of days? Jack threw him a thumbs up and disappeared back into the bathroom. I tried not to let my nervous eagerness show as Butch swept open the blue door to purgatory. A vast desert wasteland greeted us. After what my shoulder demon had told me, I didn't hesitate for a moment before passing over the threshold. We walked out onto the alkali sand, kicking up soft, acrid clouds as our feet hit windswept dunes. Our surroundings seemed to be a large, dry lake bed, completely flat and devoid of life for miles in any direction. Small dust devils sent spirals into the sky,
blurring the distant mountains blocking the horizon. Towards the center of the desert, a twinkle of bright, colorful lights thrummed along with the slow, distant beat of joyous hymn. "It's going to take a few hours to walk there," I complained. "Didn't the fairy mention something about a subway?" "Just wait, it'll find us." That raised a few further questions, but I got distracted by the sound of the distant hymns dropping the beat. I began wondering exactly what kind of heavenly song would make me want to start twerking when the ground began to shake violently below me. I fell on my ass alongside XMac and Babs. Butch managed to keep his feet and raised up a hand as if hailing a cab. Suddenly, a gigantic beast erupted from the sand and slid to a stop before us. Its huge cylindrical body ended in a huge gaping maw lined with 3-foot-long teeth that dripped saliva. Butch walked up to the creature's mouth, grabbed a hold of its tooth, and hauled himself into the mouth. He looked back at us. "You guys coming or what?" The rest of us scrambled to our feet. I tried desperately to swallow the knot in my throat as I gripped the vibrating animal's incisor and swung myself onto its tongue. When we were all safely inside the mouth and it closed around us, I felt the huge worm begin to burrow under the ground again. Babs started up a flashlight, illuminating the small portion of the orifice we occupied. The worm's tongue undulated unpleasantly under my feet, keeping me perpetually attempting to keep my balance. "I've got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret, to make me frown. I had strings, but now I'm free. There are no strings on me." I thought I was singing under my breath, but XMac turned to Butch to ask, "Is he always like this?" "For as long as I've known him, yeah." "Hey, if you guys don't think Pinocchio jokes are appropriate while in the mouth of a giant sandworm, I just feel sorry for you," I told him, perfunctory. "Death worm," XMac said. "Huh? We're in a Mongolian death worm. It's a similar but legally distinct creature." "I'm pretty sure purgatory is outside the jurisdiction of most copyright laws." "I wouldn't be so sure if I were you," XMac warned. "All the major studios have branch offices out here." I shook my head. Spoil sport. "So how long are we going to have to ride inside Butch's mom?" That got a laugh out of Babs, which also served to get Butch's murderous look onto her and off of me. As it turned out, the answer to my question was about 5 more seconds away. I felt the tongue under me attempt to spell out the alphabet as it broke the surface and shuddered to a halt. My anxiety kicked into high gear as the maw began to open. I had been wrong. The distant music we had heard before was not a heavenly plea for redemption. Pounding electronic dance music poured in from the worm's mouth, and the undulating tongue unceremoniously pushed us out. I landed in a superhero pose on the hard-packed sand, my cloak swirling around me impressively. Babs gracefully stepped off the tongue and grinned down at me. "Having fun?" she asked. "I think I might still be drunk on virgin's blood," I told her, looking around as the others clambered out of the worm's mouth. I had been all wrong about purgatory. I was expecting penitence, monotonous forms of torture, people praying for salvation, maybe. Instead, I saw large tents set up in rows, forming a semicircle several miles long. Humans and monsters in an eclectic array of costumes rode bicycles and scooters around the dusty roads. Grotesquely decorated buses blasted music as crowds hung out the windows, drinking and dancing. In the center of the desert area, surrounded by the tent circles, a large sculpture of a stick figure glowed softly in the scorching daylight. "Welcome to purgatory," Butch murmured. It started as a weekend trip to Las Vegas. A 3-day weekend was coming up, so my friends wanted to add spice to their lives, and Vegas was on the bucket list. Not mine, theirs. I wanted to stay home and watch old cartoons I'd bought from the video store. Maybe just sleep in that Friday. Maybe I didn't make it clear to them, or maybe they just ignored me, but they had already bought me a plane ticket and booked a hotel room. With it being too late to refund anything, and out of financial obligation, I couldn't let that money go to waste and be a bad, boring friend. We landed and reached the hotel before noon. I had 5 friends with me, and everyone was feeling the excitement, especially one, Sadie. Sadie was the group extrovert, the leader. She didn't suggest Vegas, but she sure as hell put herself in charge the moment the others considered the trip. Standing in front of us in the hotel lobby, she held a list of places for us to check out. I stood by and let her list them off, everyone casting votes on which place to skip, which place to start with, and which ones to save for last. What we ended up with was a schedule starting with the most fun and the physically demanding stuff, gradually leading towards the more exciting, unsavory stuff. I had already mentally decided to call it when evening rolled around, to avoid the clubs. I guess I am the boring friend after all. I will say this about Vegas. A lot of places were surprisingly clean. Don't get me wrong, we saw plenty of streets that looked like the physical manifestation of a painful hangover, but many were straight out of Hollywood. It's colorful, it's loud, it's a theme park that people live in. It was almost surreal when you ended up on streets that looked plain or ordinary. Men in suits, kids leaving school, that kind of thing. I guess I knew very little about Las Vegas, of course. A lot of it is normal, but still, I found it interesting. When you turned onto a street where the buildings looked like modern art, I knew I'd be in for a hell of a time. Day drinking, slot machines, live shows, you name it. I can admire the work and effort they put into all of it, but it just wasn't for me. When we had dinner at what I thought was a nice casino restaurant, until I saw the male servers were in very tight, revealing outfits, I had just about mentally checked out. "Hey, I think I'm done," I said, before the chorus of ahs could get any louder. "I'm tired. The flight gave me a headache and everything." "Take a pill in my purse," one of them said. I think rest is better right now. You guys have fun, though. Try not to stay out too late." I felt older with every word and excuse. I'm 28, and I was talking like I was 48. That being said, the amount of free relief I felt walking into that empty hotel room was criminal, and I must have felt tired to some degree because the bed I fell onto had my eyes drooping. It was the cool, soft Egyptian cotton sheets that had me feeling that sleep was the finest pleasure on earth. I know that says a lot about me, but still, it was pretty good. I turned on the TV and flicked through the channels, finally ending up on a new episode of How It's Made. Well, maybe it was an old episode, I don't know. What I can say for sure is that my brain was locked in, and as the sun fell behind the horizon, I was gone. I woke up to a call. My phone was buzzing beside my head, the vibration doing more to wake me up than the light-hearted jingle I had set for a ringtone. I said the name, Sadie. "Yeah," I groaned. "What's up? It's 5 in the morning. Where are you guys?" "Hey, you're really missing out." Sadie's voice was garbled by music. "We're up the road, towards the red place. We're in the club with the big green monster truck out front. You can't miss it. Come on." "You underestimate me," I muttered. I turned over in bed and looked out the window. The city was alive, even after a full night. Lights and sounds, the distant thump of music. There had to be some stellar muting in the walls because I could see that the party was not far away. I thought about going. It was the idea of missing out that bothered me a little, because I didn't think I was missing out. Yet when so many people you call friends say that you are, you start to wonder if you really know how to live at all. Maybe the happiness you feel from simple things isn't as potent as the happiness you get while being drunk in a club with your friends. Screw that, I said. I knew that was a dumb way of thinking, but I also didn't feel that tired anymore. The least I could do was enjoy the trip my own way, and at that moment, I just wanted to go for a walk. Not in the streets, of course, but I did remember Sadie mentioning on her list of activities a walk thing just outside of town. I was the only one who was interested, and she didn't seem too enthusiastic when she had told us about it. I got out of bed and texted her, asking for the address, to which she sent me the Google business thing. No official page or anything, just a bare bones minimum. It lacked that Vegas flair everything had, and for me, that was a plus. Just after midday, I arrived at the place. I paid the taxi guy and jumped out into the heat. I always had decent clothes for outdoors with me. It was like my entire wardrobe. Yet the heat was still a surprise. I guess being in a cool car for half an hour would make it feel like stepping into an oven. The trail started a small collection of shacks, with one large building that looked like it was in good condition. It was painted an ugly yellow with small cartoonish paints all around it, like a cactus character, a tumbleweed, with some classic Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote thrown in for good measure. I don't think they were going for a cowboy theme, but that's what I felt when I saw the owner. A tall woman wearing chaps, a 10-gallon hat, and a checkered shirt. She looked like she had seen some things, just shocking the way the skin beneath her eyes seemed to bubble. Yet, when she saw me, she gave me the warmest smile. "You must be Cassandra, right?" she greeted, marching over with her hands outstretched. Yes, that's me," I said, holding mine out. She took and shook my arm like a wet noodle. "I'm not too late?" "Not at all. Some eccentric fellows are already set up for the first group today. There's still time to join them before they go." "Group?" "Yeah, I find it better to send people in groups. Less chance of people getting lost or bunching up on the trail. Better for pictures, you see." "Right. We also have a route for horses if you're interested in..." No horses. They scare me. I'll stick with the walking group." "Fair enough. I won't press you." I always hated when people said that. Nothing made me feel more pressured. Still, she was the sweetest lady, sweeter than honey and iced tea. I didn't say anything more and followed her to the start of the trail. There was clear signage with numbers near the fence and gate, indicating the different trails. The trail she pointed me to didn't have a sign or a number. "The first group should be waiting there." She pointed down the trail towards a huge rock. "They all set to leave in 5 minutes. Do you have anything you need?" "Water, hat, sunscreen," I said. "Good. It's hot now, but it'll get cool later. Little known fact about the desert," she said, pointing up a finger as if she expected me to take notes. I knew that already, of course. I nodded and started walking up the trail towards the rock. She already started her march back to the main building. I was feeling pretty good, excited even. I love the oppressiveness of the desert, and I was hoping that being 20 minutes out of Vegas, I would get to enjoy the natural beauty of it all. There was a group of people waiting by the rock, but looking at them was a little weird. I mean, I don't want to show my ignorance, but I think they were religious or just had some kind of cultural thing going on. Maybe I was about to walk with some foreigners from overseas, or it was some kind of LARP group. I didn't know. There was at least 20 people there, and it was hard to tell if they were all men or not because they were dressed in robes from head to toe. Not flowing robes either, but a lot more neat and constructed. My first real thought wasn't, what the hell are they wearing, but how the hell haven't they melted? All but one of their robes was red, but the last one, which was black, He stood tall and straight, the first one to turn in my direction. Upon seeing them, I was already psyching myself up to say something. Approaching the group of people alone was terrifying. As you can guess, Sadie and her group are the only ones who adopted me at work. I was just happy they did, because I would have never gone up to them otherwise. Room for one more?" I said with a forced smile. I was quiet at first, but I supposed it was better to be a little too quiet than a little too loud. The ones in the red robes turned from me and looked at the one in black. "Please do. Have you ever been on this trail before?" the man said. "No, first time. Be sure to stick close and conserve your energy. It is to be a long walk." The man in the black robe pointed towards the desert, the distant rocks, and the sparse foliage. It felt so surreal, but also right, like I had stepped into the adventure I wanted. Only something kept throwing me off. It was the silence from such a large group. When we started on the path, I didn't hear anything from the people in the red robes. The only ones I had heard speak up until that moment was the man in the black robe. He would speak to me every few minutes, usually to point something out, but the gaps between those moments were growing longer. Initially, I thought he was a guide, but it became clear as he drifted into the others that he was just familiar with the trail. I was too shy to keep the conversation going, finding myself just enjoying the sights. The range of colors was just incredible. So many people think the desert is just muted, dry color, but there are just so many different shades of light and dark. The vibrant oranges when we found ourselves in the ravine were stunning. We followed a stream in that shallow ravine until the trail opened into the desert again, just in time to see the sun settle beyond the horizon. "The sky becomes like blood," the man in the black robe said behind me. I jumped, not at his voice, but because I thought I was at the back of the group. I wanted to keep everyone in view. "A beautiful red, yes?" I turned to look at him. He was looking at me. I could see his eyes, his pale skin through the slit in the robe. It was odd to look at because his hands were dark. Another culture thing, maybe. When I had finally registered his words as a question, I stuttered in response. "Oh, yeah," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. I took the hoodie out of my backpack and pulled it on. "Amazing how fast the cold comes in too, huh?" "Yes. Do you think you can make the walk back?" he asked. "We should almost be there, so—" No, we are quite far now," he corrected. "By night, the journey back should be quicker, but 5 hours seems about right." My heart sank. I thought we had taken some turns and were just about to see the start of the trail again over the hill. Yet, looking around, I should have been able to see that distant glow of Vegas. Instead, all I saw was dark, robed figures shambling ever onward into the desert. My water had run out, my phone had long since died, and I was hungry. My panic was stiff at first, but I began to hear it in my voice. "Then, let's turn back," I said. "You can go back. We're heading somewhere else," the man in black said. "Is it close?" "Very, but you won't be able to join us, not as you are." He looked me up and down, and I wondered if he was referring to my clothes and how I stood out amongst them, but something in his eyes showed a different kind of disgust. It was like my entire existence didn't fit in, not just my clothes. His tone was growing more serious, less friendly. He was losing patience. At that point, I noticed a building noise, a rumbling which I mistook for chatter amongst the men and women in red robes, but as it grew louder, it sounded more like an uncoordinated hum, like they were all humming a song that none of them knew the lyrics to. "Again, too late," he murmured, "as it should be. So it is." "Too late?" I repeated. "Mind where you step. Once your weight is on your foot, your choice is made. The humming had reached a breaking point in tone. The night sky became a lot darker. The stars, the moon, they vanished. The midnight blue became pitch black, a surreal void. It felt like something was blocking it out of sight, because that same darkness seemed to move wherever I looked. Yet the desert remained illuminated by some strange source of light. I could see the red robes against the pitch black, and I watched as they marched across the sand. I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread, a feeling of weakness. My whole body began to ache, and every effort seemed to strain my muscles and even my bones. I knew this feeling, the one bubbling inside me. It was many years ago when I was a child. I was coughing in bed constantly, day after day. That weakness kept me wondering how hollow I could get. I felt as weak and flimsy as a thin plastic bag. My heart, I could feel its every beat, as if all my insides were numb, and only it soldiered on. I was waiting for it to give out. The people in the red robes began to shed their blood-red fabric, naked forms that began to age and decay before my eyes. A space in the inky void ahead of me opened up, a shining white door, tall and thin. The way was clear, and I didn't have it in me to walk on. I was terrified. "Why are you scared?" the man in the black robe asked. "What awaits you is an end to the pain. Keep walking strong." He placed his hand on my shoulder and guided me. The people ahead of me were growing more grotesque by the second. I had no idea what made their bodies, so I was made to watch them unmake themselves. The skin, the fat, the pus, the blood, the shades of red began to turn blue and green. My head was burning inside. I felt dehydrated. While my body was in a state of shock and fear, my mind was trying its best to grip reality, to steer me away. The man in the black robe seemed to sense it, because he stopped walking and looked at me. With all my energy, I looked at him. "You cannot go back now. Your life is with them. It is only natural to pass over to the next plane." I felt the heat of my tears. It was just like those nights years ago. The very real fear of death. I'm ashamed of it now, but I wasn't thinking of my loved ones, not even my family. I didn't think of all the wrongs I'd done, the regrets I had. When I looked into that man's eyes, all I thought was, why now? The man seemed to sigh, but I didn't hear the exhale. His shoulders slumped and the humming faded completely. The shambling corpses turned around to look back at me with their empty eye sockets. "The dead must be laid to rest. It is only natural. The earth will bind the body and free the spirit." The man in black grabbed both my shoulders, twisting me around, and began to lay me on the ground as if I weighed nothing. I couldn't move. I could only watch as he began to scoop sand with his hands over me. I heard the rumbling again, but it sounded angry. I looked up as far as I could. It made my neck ache. I could see the world upside down, the white arch, and the silhouettes of the dead against the divine light. The corpses were moving closer, and they radiated malice. More tears, and even a pathetic whimper. "Hush," the man in the black robe said. "They are not upon you yet." He was working fast, and only a few seconds later, I could feel sand over every inch of my body. He finished by pouring the sand over my face, covering me completely. I heard the dead close in. I heard a muttering of words, then I heard his scream. I try not to imagine the pain one must feel to make those sounds. He was still alive, but his cries grew further away as they carried him towards the white arch. I could gather that much from what I heard. As his voice faded, the rumbling ceased and strength returned to my body. I could breathe, and I was breathing in sand, was choking, gasping. I sat up, coughing and sputtering. I noticed immediately the pink and purple hue of the sky. On my back, I felt the warmth of the morning sun. Looking all around, I saw nothing. No dead people, no man in black, no inky sky, no white arch. All the evidence I had was the blood on the sand, and it's trailing off before stopping completely. I found a road and somebody to point me in the direction of Vegas, but they weren't willing to give me a lift back. Luckily, after an hour or two of walking, someone else did. I watched as we drove past the road leading to the yellow building where the trail began. I think I even saw Dorothy talking to a group of tourists. When I arrived at the hotel, I dug my room key out of my sandy backpack and held it to the front of the machine. It still worked, and a few seconds later I was taking a shower, trying to let the hot water bring a little more warmth to my body. After a while, I thought about the man in black. He wasn't a dead man, not like the others. He didn't seem evil, but he didn't seem sane either. No matter what the conclusion I made about him, I realized that he saved my life, and he paid the price for it. It was a thought that snapped everything into place, and I cried in the shower as all the feelings rushed at me once again. I spoke about this experience to only one person, a priest. I don't think he believed a word I said, not really. I think he thought I was talking about a dream or a nightmare. Yet he showed enough concern to say something wise and biblical about sacrifice. It wasn't his words that convinced me to redefine my faith. It was the thought of believing in nothing when something like that happened to me. It didn't sit right. That's what I gained for the price that someone else paid. I pray that it's enough. I don't have much time, so if things sound a little weird, just bear with me. This is a warning. If you see black clouds at all, just run. Doesn't matter where you are. I don't know if this thing is spreading. I'm getting ahead of myself. On April 5th, my wife and I took off for a wedding in Vermont. Before we left, we heard the news talk about a big northeastern storm that's going to drop a bunch of snow and ice. Even though it looks like we're going to be okay since our plane is landing technically in New Hampshire, just south of the storm. The flight was 2 hours, but about halfway through the trip, the clouds started to change color. Not gray like you'd expect. Darker. More like black. Looking more like volcanic ash clouds than normal storm clouds. My wife was busy playing her Nintendo Switch, but since I was laid off, I had a lot on my mind. I was a little surprised that nobody else noticed it, but off in the distance, I could have sworn I saw something move in the distance. It was hard to tell. It sort of looks like a wing swooping through the clouds, like a fish that makes 180s at the surface. The pressure wake pushed the clouds outward, like something was coming and then changed its mind. It had to be a trick of the eye, probably. It had to be the sun hitting and reflecting away off the ash clouds. I shouldn't have been assuming they were ash clouds, but time proved me right. The pilot never made any announcement, and I didn't really see anything either, so I kept my mouth shut. Maybe if I hadn't, things would have turned out different for Courtney. When I looked away, I happened to catch one of the flight attendants staring at her. Her head slightly tilted, and she wouldn't take her eyes off of me. It sounds strange, but it felt like she was waiting to see if I was about to tell my wife what I had seen. I decided to keep looking busy, and even decided to shut my eyes for a few minutes. Thinking she had just seen something might distract the old veteran stewardess's attention. It had to be about 10 minutes because I listened to my favorite song twice and another song before opening my eyes. And to my shock, she was still looking at me. Now, her teeth looked different, like she was trying hard to smile. I swear it looked like her gums were bleeding. I decided to get up and go to the bathroom, the one farthest from her. That must have done the trick, because when I came back, she had moved on to her normal duties of serving passengers. When I got back, my wife finally noticed the black clouds, but by this time we could barely see past the wing. Did the pilots see anything? Not wanting to worry her, I assured her they have all kinds of communications and radar. Even if they can't see in front of them, they know where they're going. She gave me a look. Courtney was like that. She could see right through me like an MRI machine. The fasten seatbelt sign came on, and with it, the pilot's voice. "Attention travelers, we'll be making our final descent momentarily. Please make sure all loose items are stored, as you won't be needing them." What's that mean? That was weird. I looked around, and thankfully, someone else, who I would shortly find out was our air marshal for the flight, stood up and headed for the cockpit, his face a mask of concern. He shut the drapes behind him, so no one could see him. I heard him knocking loudly and asking to be let in. Just then, the stewardess from earlier rushed by me, running against my arm. Suddenly, my arm was in drastic pain. I looked down, and it looked like someone had taken a cheese grater to it. My wife looked to try and help me. "Oh, God, are you okay? What happened?" I told her I wasn't sure and started pressing dirty paper towels and Skittles wrappers on my wound to stop the bleeding. My wife yelped for help. Other people started looking, and in the confusion, nobody else saw the air marshal struggling, except me, as he was pulled into the bathroom by the stewardess. Except she now looked more like a demon, with black scales on the forearms of her lethal hands and sharp claws. There was panic on the man's face, or maybe it was pain. I don't know. Just as the door shut, I could see the man's skin turning red as if it were being burned off by a torch, or whatever that thing pretending to be a stewardess was. Before I could tell anyone to look, the air marshal disappeared into the airplane bathroom. By this time, my wife had noticed my face and looked up front, but she didn't see anything. "Are you okay?" I tried to tell her something. It took the air marshal, but she just looked at me in confusion. And that was when the gunshot rang out in the cabin. The bullets began flying out of the bathroom from where the air marshal had been dragged. His screams were guttural. He must have gotten loose, but he never made it out. More bullets went off, and everyone scattered. Several shots hit the cockpit, and luckily, they didn't penetrate the bulletproof door. Unfortunately, one of the bullets did shoot out the pressurized windows. The next few minutes were a blur. Everyone was panicking, and with no direction, everyone braced for the inevitable. I looked out the window just as we were about to hit. We were through the clouds, and what I was seeing wasn't New Hampshire. It looked like some kind of hellscape. Lava rivers and large mounds in the distance, horned monstrosities roaming the outskirts of the airport. The barbed wire fencing that lay more like fences made from rubber or skin, and the buildings were covered in ash and strange demonic symbols. After that, it was only blackness. I came to eventually, hanging and nearly falling out of my seat. I appeared to be only a few feet off the ground, and I was alone. My wife's seat was broken clean off. I can't see her, and I don't see anyone else living. I prepared myself and unlatched the seatbelt. I tucked and managed to save my 33-year-old ankles when I hit the ground. I stood up, letting my bearings hit me, when I finally got a look around and noticed there was no sun. It should have been there. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but it looks like midnight out there. Alone and scared, I tried calling out, but I was afraid to draw the attention of those giant monsters I'd seen just before the crash. Just then, I heard a girl screaming. Instinct kicked in, and I ran to help. I jumped over to the debris and body parts from the passengers. All I could think was that it might be Courtney, and I had to do something. I rounded one of the plane engines that was on fire, and I wish I didn't see what I had witnessed next. An early 20s Gen Z girl covered in dirt, her face cut and badly bleeding. So bad I couldn't tell if she still had her eyes. But then the worst of it finally hit me when I realized what she was doing. She was feeling for her legs, or her lack thereof. She cried out, screaming for her mother, while she grabbed at the stumps of what had been her legs. I have to admit I was scared. I was in shock. How could I help her? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't let her suffer alone. I took a step when suddenly I heard another woman, but this one wasn't screaming. She was laughing. Suddenly, a beautiful, terrifying demon woman walked around the corner, and with her came 2 tiny crawling demons.
"Oh, my child, save your screams. We're just getting started."
With that, she snapped her fingers, and I watched as the demons tore into the poor girl. Her screams drew more of the demon dogs.
"The more you despair, the more you will suffer. Embrace the suffering, and you will be released from it."
The girl cried as best she could as the monster tore into her throat, but with one last breath, she must have gave her what the demon wanted. Suddenly, they were surrounded in black smoke and disappeared. The demon dogs, the demon woman, and the girl, all gone. I was left alone among the debris, the death, the ash-filled air. I didn't know what to do. I found a place to hide. I thought this was hell. Found out later, it wasn't. After having a breakdown under the debris of the crashed plane and still having no idea if my wife was even alive, I had this weird feeling that I had to keep going. It just kept saying, keep alive, keep moving. I can hear those demon dogs coming. I need to be fast. Sometime after my encounter, I heard something loud and deep. It was familiar somehow, though. It sounded like an engine, a plane. I ran through piles of debris and burning cars, planes, cruise ships, and buses. I got to the top of the debris mound just in time to see a 747 punch through the clouded barrier. This one landed just like it was supposed to. I looked up and noticed flying demons scattering as the plane hooked the terminal gate. Just then, the hundreds of demons surrounding the tarmac shrieked like they were welcoming something. Just then, from a shadowy hole in the ground, a giant snake erupted. The giant snake-like creature slithered around the plane like a boa constrictor, preparing to suffocate its prey. The doors opened, and immediately I could hear people screaming for their lives. I watched as a humanoid demon dressed like a pilot in a torn uniform, with random horns tearing its suit of skin off. It was like it was wearing a costume. It started throwing passengers off the plane. Demon dogs and other emaciated humanoid demon things began to swarm the passengers. A middle-aged man in a $5,000 suit, he screamed as the creatures tore his clothes off and he was carried into the main terminal. He swung his suitcase like a weapon. Just before he disappeared, one of the smallest humanoid demons jumped up and bit down on his wrist, stopping him from injuring any of the rest of them with that metal suitcase. I could hear him scream even louder, begging for help and to be let go. Before he vanished into the terminal, I saw the little demon tear the guy's hand off. Was that where they took Courtney, I wondered? I navigated my way inside. I don't know why. I put myself through these sights of something in me just kept demanding that I move forward. Like I had to see it. I watched as all the passengers from the plane, buses, the people who had just got lost on car rides ended up here. They were sorted onto paths that were surrounded by barbed wire. "Come on, you meat sacks, it's time to get sorted out. Which one of you is one of us, and which one of you is for the meat grinder?" One of the sick-looking demons with a sharp pike yelled at these poor souls, shuffling them through the giant rotating spikes, just like TSA instructing passengers to go through security. Demon guards pushed each person towards the front of the line, where a larger demon would look at each person to classify them. Aviation, infantry, necrotics, this one has spirit. Training pits, we'll beat that out of you, or we'll eat you. The guy looked like a soldier type. Broad shoulders, tattoos, looked like someone from a movie, with the army guys in Benghazi. One by one, people were chosen for roles in Hell's forces. As far as I can tell, there was a small percent of prisoners that the demons didn't want anything to do with, which I thought was pretty weird. Wouldn't everyone make a good soldier? I never got my answer. One of the flying demons landed near the ventilation duct I was hiding in, and I needed to sneak away. I made my way through the vents. To my relief, nothing was in there with me, at least nothing that ever found me. Eventually, I found my way to the airport authority office. It looked guarded, several bear-type looking guys and big old demons that guarded the door. Using the vents, I quietly snuck in and found what appeared to be a map with some demon casting a spell over the airport. On the giant omnidirectional map, I could see a bubble around the airport. At first I thought it was hiding this place. Whatever that thing in the airport authority office is, it's how they're cloaking the airport, and the demons are building an army with our own people. I don't know how, but somehow in this office I have signal. Maybe it's how no one knows this place is gone. I don't know. I don't know anything up until an hour ago. I didn't even believe in hell. If anyone gets this message, you need to tell everyone about this demon cloaking this place. If it's something more than turning people into demons, I don't know, but we have to save these people. Every plane that lands is either adding more soldiers to the enemy ranks or enslaving more innocent souls. The worst part is, the planes are leaving. Who's on them? I don't know, but they can't be human. I'm gonna keep exploring. I can't explain this feeling, but something is telling me that Courtney's not far. I'm gonna find out as much as I can and come back here to relay what I can. This has to be the start of something. Can you say that again?
Which part?
The date, Dad. The recorder wasn't close enough. I want to make sure we get everything.
Why is it so important that you get every last detail anyway?
Because that's what the doctor said, Dad. The more detail we get, the better he can help you.
Oh, is that right? He's gonna help me, huh? How's he gonna do that exactly? Stuff some more magic pills in my pocket? Maybe sign me up for group therapy? Those are always loads of fun.
No, I think he just wants to get a better understanding of...
He can't help me. Nobody can. Better psychiatrists have tried and failed. You wouldn't believe me anyway. There's no point.
Well, if nothing else, it would help us and the doc to make better decisions regarding you. Look, I promise that I'll listen to everything you have to say. I promise I'll believe you. All right?
Don't say that. You can't promise me something like that. It's all bullshit, and you know it.
All right, fine, fair enough. I promise that I will try to believe, okay? I'll try. Look, forget about the doctor, all right? I want to know what happened that night. Me. I want to know what you were doing in Norway. Why you can never get a good night's sleep. Just tell me, please.
Fine. It's February 20th, 1943. That's when it all went down. The Axis powers had been almost driven out of Africa, and the Soviets had efficiently turned the tide of war in Eastern Europe. We had the Nazis on the run, for the time being, at least. They were vulnerable, sure, but they still had every capability of rebounding and kicking our asses. As such, the U.S. was particularly interested in taking out any and all Axis weapon development programs.
Weapon development programs? What, like tanks or atomic bombs or...
Exactly. The Allies, specifically, targeted their hard water factories to cripple their production of atomic bombs. But there were other targets. Their so-called Wonder Weapons project, scattered all over German-occupied territory. Manufacturing depots, chemical weapons labs, bioweapon research centers, etc., etc. That's what I was doing in Norway.
Where in Norway did they send you?
Northern Norway. Far off the mainland lay an island with a Nazi outpost on it. Very little was known about the place at the time regarding its exact purpose and mission. According to our spies inland and the Norwegian rebels,
The locals referred to it simply as Fort Ond. They said it was a bad place, that the prisoners who were taken there were never seen again, that the water bordering its shores were barren of all aquatic life and colder than even the most bone-chilling frostbite. Command didn't give a shit about any of that, though. They were only concerned with two things. Why is this installation so far away from German homeland, and why is it so far from mainland Norway? The conclusion they came to was that the Nazis had to be developing some sort of weapon that they didn't want to risk infecting a lot of people with.
So, they thought it was a chemical weapons plant?
No, they thought it was a bioweapons lab. Smallpox, anthrax, that kind of stuff. We thought that's what they were doing there, but we didn't know for sure. That's when my unit came in, and where Operation Maelstrom was greenlit.
Maelstrom?
I didn't pick the damn name anyway, so they wanted to keep the operation as covert as possible. Minimum manpower. 1 squad of British SAS, 1 squad of Canadian Commandos, and last but not least, 1 squad of Army Rangers, including yours truly.
What was the purpose of the mission? Just to gather intel, or,
Our first priority was the eradication of the fort's inhabitants and the seizure of any relevant intel. However, we were also prepared for it to turn into a sabotage mission at a moment's notice. Leadership felt pretty confident about the bioweapons theory and didn't want to take any chances with letting the stuff potentially get away, hence the limited manpower. The last thing we wanted was for the Krauts to get spooked by a large invasion force and flee with the samples.
Dad, are you okay?
Yeah, just give me a second.
Really? You gotta do that now, huh?
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Is the smoke gonna bother your little nose that much? Would you prefer I did it somewhere else?
I'd prefer you didn't do it at all, though in a way it's oddly inspiring. Senior citizen, part of the greatest generation, still puffing that shit all these years like it's of no consequence to your health.
To hell with the consequences. Can I continue now, or is this gonna turn into an intervention? 'Cause if so, tell me now so I can save you the time and just leave the room to enjoy the rest of my smoke.
No, please, continue.
We were all flown to Iceland for our briefing. From the moment I arrived, I had no doubt about the operation. The sheer lack of intel we had to go off regarding fort-sized manpower and the exact purpose just seemed odd to me. I remember thinking to myself, I hope there's enough men. When I did so, I caught my friend Weathers looking around too. I could tell he was thinking the same thing. From there, we boarded a British destroyer that took us less than 10 miles from the island. We had to travel the remaining distance on our own in 2 PT boats. I remember just how cold it was that night, how we all subconsciously stood closer to each other than normal in a vain attempt to stay warm, like a bunch of penguins, the lot of us. It was a half-an-hour ride to the island, so we stayed like that for a while, just hunkered up and trying to keep warm as much as we could while we waited for any sign of something. When we were about a mile from the island, we got the sign. We saw it long before we got near the stuff. When we did, we all went silent and watched as we slowed down our boats to make a cautious approach. A thick fog had blanketed the sea around the coastline in all directions for about half a mile. It had a faint red hue to it. Not a deep red, just a faintly visible one. It towered above us nearly 15 feet in the air like a tidal wave and seemingly stared us down. We slowly crept our boats up to it inch by inch until our bows were nearly kissing it. From there, a few of the Canadians on the adjacent boat got some equipment and began prodding the fog for any signs of toxin. We all sat there and waited for them to finish their work. As they did, I took notice of the absolute unnaturalness of it all. It made
No movement towards us, nor away from us, yet it billowed and contracted and breathed soothingly in places like you would expect a body of smoke to do. I remember distinctly thinking of it not as a wall, but more like a veil or a curtain, hiding the island from us. A few minutes later, the Canadians signaled over to our boats and gave our commander, Captain Hawks, the thumbs up. The fog wasn't toxic as far as they could tell. Given our mission, though, we couldn't take any chances of it being gas of some kind. Better safe than sorry. So we donned our gas masks and made sure our suits were nice and sealed up. I, in particular, had taken the liberty of duct taping around the gloves and boots to ensure it was tight. Then we started our boats back up and slowly sailed into the unknown. First, I couldn't see anything. The fog was so thick it limited my visibility to just a few feet in front of me, and even less in front of that boat. We couldn't have our lights on for fear of being spotted. When we were out in the open water, this was fine, of course. The moon and stars lit up the surrounding water nicely. But now, there was little to no light penetrating the fog, and we were engulfed in near total darkness. So we just slowly inched our way forward, safely as we could. I just sat there and watched the red vapor hit and dance off my goggles when I searched for any sign of land. For a while, nobody said a word. We all just waited for what seemed like an eternity. The longer we pushed ahead, the tighter the grip on my rifle became as my nerves started up. Finally, one of the Brits broke the silence. I watched him tap the man in front of him and heard him whisper, "You sure this is right?" His sentence was quickly interrupted. We had landed. The entire boat shook wildly as a few of us lost our footing and had to grab the side walls to stay upright. As we did so, I looked around me and noticed the fog gradually growing thinner as we made our approach. Steadily, its opacity diminished. I could begin to see shapes through the veil. The crunching noises ceased a few seconds later, and with them, so did the fog from my line of sight. It was still there, but it was thinner and lower to the ground than it was on the open sea. It only came up to our knees from that point on, which meant I could finally see our objective, the island. It was a mess of scattered jagged rocks and hills, caverns and towering cliffs that seemed to scatter in all directions, like a porcupine made of stone. At its center, one giant hill stood out. I followed it from the base to the peak with my eyes, and at its peak there was a door. That was it. No trace of human life, no pathways, no trenches, no buildings of any kind. Nothing that would suggest any sort of operation that we were undertaking on the island. There were a few guard towers, of course. We knew at least that much from our aerial photos, but we had chosen our landing site specifically to be in a blind spot they wouldn't see us from. That was it, though. Apart from the door that stuck out amidst the terrain, looking utterly unnatural in the distance, there was no sign of life. No buzzing insects, no splashing fish, no chirping birds, not even the wind itself seemed to bow before the island's authority and ceased completely. No life whatsoever. I thought back to when my first encounter of the fog and just how right I was in my thought process. We truly had crossed a veil of some kind. Captain Hawks gave the hand signals. We all filed out and patrolled inland as fast as we could to a nearby cave. The Norwegians were waiting for us there.
The Norwegians? Were they the ones who gave you the fort's intel to begin with?
The very same. Adding them to our roster brought our total to 35 men.
Dad, it's okay. Take your time.
We headed into the cave and linked up with the Norwegians, who sat steadfast in a defensive position. One of them stood up as soon as we breached the darkness of the cavern and swung his gun over in our direction,
shouting at us, presumably to lower our weapons, before quickly lowering his own to make a half-hearted apology. Hawks was livid. He stormed over to the man with one forceful strike of his fist and sent the poor Norwegian hurtling towards the ground. "You some kind of fucking moron, kid? I was this close to blowing your goddamn head off." The commander of the Norwegians rushed over to stand between the two of them. "Please forgive us, sir. We've been on the edge since we arrived a few days ago. It was an honest mistake." He helped his fallen soldier back to his feet and ordered him to the back of the cave to tend to his face. Afterwards, he and Hawks stared at each other for a few seconds in silence while we all just waited to see who would speak. The leader of the Norwegians spoke first. "Something is wrong, very wrong. Our intel is severely off," he said. "None of the guard towers have occupants, and we haven't seen Nazi soldiers patrolling the island in 3 days. We've been spying on the island for weeks now, as best we could. The entire time we did so, the soldiers were patrolling the shores, manning the towers, and watching the coastlines. But 3 days ago, this fog emerged, obscures our vision, and made it nearly impossible to see anything on the island. Since we arrived, we've done multiple sweeps and scouting runs along the island's surface before you arrived. No one is here, American, not a soul. It's like they just vanished, at least from the island's surface." I looked back over at McKinley, who did the same. We exchanged confused looks at one another before looking back at the two leaders, who were now talking too quietly for anyone to hear. Finally, Hawks turned to face us and gave a deep sigh. "We think the Nazis have locked themselves away in the fort's cave system and interior. According to our good buddies here, the island's surface is safe. Let's hope they're right. Conduct final checks on all your equipment, then form up by the cave entrance. We're going in." So we got into formation and made our way up the rough terrain to the door. It was the one I had spotted when we had landed. As far as we could tell, it was the only entrance to the interior of the fort. The absence was nerve-wracking. The cold, wet staircase that led up to the fort entrance proved difficult to scale with all my equipment, which was made all the more dangerous, of course, by the fog. With it clinging about knee level on every surface of the island, made it damn near impossible to see where you were stepping, so we just slowly tiptoed our way up to the door as best we could. All the while, nobody uttered a word. So quiet I could hear my own heartbeat throbbing in my ears. Eventually, we reached the top of the stairs. The door itself was monolithic. Monolithic, huh? What, like ancient? Oh yeah, stood nearly 9 feet tall and looked like it was made out of bronze or copper. I don't know, some kind of faintly orange metal. It was covered in strange engravings that could only be described as hieroglyphics. They weren't, of course, but that was the only comparison I'd been able to find since that day. And believe me, I've tried. I looked through every damn book I could think of. Nothing comes close to the symbols and markings I saw engraved on that door. It was like a foreign language of some kind. Didn't look like it was written or chipped away from the door by an expert's hand, so much as it looked like it was slashed or cut, like something had hacked its way in with claws or teeth to create the strange writing. It didn't look like a human hand had done it neither. Looking up at the door, I felt like an explorer, like I'd found something lost to mankind for millennia, and I was rediscovering it. Only I didn't want to be the person to discover this. At that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to be aware that this place existed, let alone be the one to have to open that damn door and walk into God knew what. We readied our explosives, expecting to have to breach our way in. To our surprise, though, the wooden beam that was attached to the door lifted. The monolith opened slightly, and with it came a stench of utter and all-devouring rot, like pus and spoiled milk, bile and sulfur, all fused into one unholy concoction that assaulted my nostrils and instantly forced tears down my cheeks. First I panicked, believing my mask wasn't secure, tight enough, and I was inhaling a toxin of some kind. But when I looked up and saw that all my team members were doing the same, our masks all working fine, we couldn't have all had potential leaks, right? The smell was truly just that powerful. The door had only given way and opened a tiny bit. Our front man quickly had to ask for help as the door was too heavy to heave by himself. 4 men, including me, pushed with all our mights and then quickly ran out of the way as soon as the door was completely open, so the guys behind us could aim down that opening. When they did, they didn't see much. Their flashlights shined straight into a wall, angling down and away from us. What lay before us was another staircase, carved out of the very stone of the mountain itself. The fog clung lower to the ground past the doorway, only coming up to about ankle height, but it still obscured the steps all the same. We stared down the doorway, waiting for orders to advance, but Hawks said nothing. He just stood there with his gun trained ahead and his other hand held up, silently telling us to wait. I suspected he was listening, waiting to hear any communication from us opening the heavy door, for any sign of enemies. There were none, however. Not a sound could be heard from down the staircase, just like everywhere else so far. Goff leaned over to me and tapped me on the shoulder. "Something's not right, man," he whispered. I did not respond. I didn't feel I needed to. Everyone was already thinking the same thing anyway. No point in vocalizing it, especially not when I think we could all see what Hawks was thinking. I watched a chill run up his spine that shook his held-up hand and rifle slightly in place. I'd never seen him like that before. He steadied himself, and with a low, reassuring grunt, which was probably more for his benefit than ours, he gave the order, "File in." So we went. We descended for about 20 feet. The staircase itself was dark, but we could see light at the bottom. The sight of light was a relief. Instantly, I felt a tiny shred of my anxiety wither away as my instincts took hold. I readied myself for any Germans that might be waiting for us at the bottom. There were no Germans, though. None left anywhere. None alive. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, the scene laid out before me like something you'd see in a crime scene. It was a big square room illuminated by gas lanterns in its center. The door directly ahead of us led to an opening in the floor with a ladder hooked to it. 2 doorways on our left and right, like a plus sign or a cross. Various crates and workstation desks lay toppled over, all facing the direction of the newly discovered staircase, like sentry posts. They all faced towards the same point, scattered throughout the room where the Nazis, half sunken in the fog and slightly obscured by it, draped over the crates, leaning up against the walls, crumpled up like soda cans in the corners. There were at least a dozen of them, their blood pooled beneath their feet, but I hardly noticed it through the tinted fog. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard the familiar jingling of empty bullet casings beneath my feet. Subsequently, bullet holes could be seen in nearly every square inch of the wall in front of us. "Jesus Christ!" Weathers shouted as we entered the room, prompting Hawks to hold up his hand and signal for us to shut up. "Whoever the fuck did this might still be here. Stay frosty," he muttered sternly to us. "Fan out. Check the room on our flanks," he commanded via hand signals. Half our men went to the room on the right, while the remaining went left. I, along with 3 others, stood guard in the lit room, kept our guns trained on the ladder ahead of us. As I knelt behind a crate to take a better defensive position,
I noticed one of the Nazis was laying face down in a puddle of his own blood. I kept my rifle trained ahead as I slowly reached over and heaved on his shoulder, forcing him to roll onto his back. He had a look of utter terror frozen on his face, with eyes wide open and mouth agape. He bore cuts and large slash marks up his chest and torso, which caused his entrails to expose themselves slightly. I looked around the room at the other men to verify, and sure enough, the ones who were submerged in the fog shared similar wounds of size and volume. The fuck happened here? I thought to myself. That thought was quickly overtaken by a doubly terrifying realization. I looked at the bullet holes directly ahead of me and thought, whatever the hell happened here, I'm standing in the same place they were. After a few tense moments of sitting with that realization, the squad checking the right room emerged, holding a few books and folders. They bore similar engravings to the ones seen on the door upon our arrival, and were bound in leather so ancient that it looked like the faintest breeze would disintegrate them if they weren't careful. They showed it to Hawks, who took one of the books and began sifting through the pages. At first, he scanned the pages carefully and thoroughly, but he quickly thereafter began to shuffle through them frantically and impatiently, before reaching back and shoving it into his pack. Right about that time, the squad from the left room emerged. A British soldier approached and said, "Just more dead krauts, sir. There's something. We found cages big enough to fit a human in. There were bodies in them, but they weren't German civilians," the Norwegian team leader interrupted. "These were fucking animals." Hawks looked like he was getting ready to say something, but he didn't get the chance. All conversation and thoughts were stopped when the sound of screaming could be heard down the ladder. With one uniform motion, all remaining men turned their guns to face the same direction as I already was. We waited for what felt like an eternity for a head to come bobbing up in the opening of the floor, for the sound of footsteps, for any sign of enemies. Nothing came. After a few minutes or so, Hawks gave the order. We were going down there. I really didn't want to do this anymore.
Dad, please, you can do it. Just take a second, okay?
The smell, Patrick.
What about it?
I can't get it out of my nose. It's been 60 goddamn years since then, and I can't get it out of my nose. God, by the time we reached the bottom, Garf had already vomited. I had to fucking cover him while he did it. Good thing I hadn't eaten anything before the briefing, else I would have too. When we reached the bottom, there was nobody, just like the rest of the island. No signs of life.
What did you see at the bottom of the ladder?
Well, it was a large cavern-like room with multiple passageways that branched off in all directions, but at its center was a well, made out of the same stone as the mountain. It somehow looked older, more ancient, more monolithic. Along its rim were the same damn etchings and carvings as the door. Upon closer examination, we saw what the source of the fog was that had plagued us since our arrival. We watched it for a while and observed the fog billowing up and out and over the top, well, in all directions at a constant, unnatural rate. Couldn't believe that such a tiny source could have produced as much as we'd seen up to that point. I couldn't believe that the colossal wall that we'd encountered upon our arrival originated from such a minuscule well deep in the mountain. As we spread out to cover the other passageways, I approached it and leaned over. Patrick, the smell was so strong that I was thrown back onto my hands and knees almost immediately from the stomach contractions. It was the source of the fog, of the smell, of everything.
What was in the well?
Blood. The whole fucking thing was full of blood. More blood than I'd ever seen in my life. More than the room upstairs. More than any other mission I'd ever seen on. And it was fresh. It boiled gently. It seemed to move on its own as though it were alive and aware of our presence in the room. And when I gazed upon it, the attack on my nose and stomach seemed like one of calculation, as though a cobra had spat in my face for daring to get too close. I wasn't allowed even a second to recover from the stench, however. That exact moment we heard more screams. Seemingly every passage in the cavern emitted what I can only describe as a wail of anguish, like the flesh was being peeled off somebody's forearm and pouring salt back into the wound at the same time. They pierced all our ears like razor blades and made me wince so hard I almost forgot about my stomach pain. How big is this place, I thought to myself. What the hell could be happening just down those tunnels? Fuck this, Hawk said. Start planting charges. We are getting out of this place as soon as possible. It was music to all our ears. One of the soldiers came over to check on me and the rest as we began to start laying charges. There was nothing professional about our process. We were just laying them out as fast as we could so that we could get the hell out of that stenched place and back to the boats. The screams continued the entire time we worked.
Were they getting closer?
I don't know. They sounded like they were coming from every passage all at once, but it was hard to tell. We had a man eyeing down every doorway just in case, though. Didn't matter. We should have been watching the walls. As I struggled to compose myself to get back to my feet, I had a front row seat for what was about to happen. Goff, the poor bastard, he was doing his rounds, laying his charges along the floor, around the well. I wanted to speak up, to tell him not to get too close, but I was still sucking in air through my teeth and couldn't get the words out. All I could do was hold my hand out to him and grunt. He turned to face me. "You gonna make it?" was the last thing I heard him say. At that very moment, an arm shot out of the well behind him, locked itself around his neck, and pulled him in head first. The arm was inhumanly long, more like a tentacle than an arm, but its form was undeniably human. It wrapped itself around his neck and dug its fingers into the side of his face as it dragged him deeper and deeper down. I watched him thrash around and kick his legs wildly in vain as he attempted to get free, spraying torrents of blood in all directions around him. He was already halfway submerged by the time our men got a hold of his feet. When they did so, another hand shot out of the wall and locked itself around Goff's waist, now pulling him in faster. I could hear gurgling and see bubbles of air making their way to the well's surface. Poor bastard was drowning in that putrid liquid. The men pulled with all their might, but it didn't slow down his descent in any noticeable way. They heaved and barked orders to the others like rabid dogs, desperate to save our comrades, but no help came. We were alone with the incomprehensible, and it was winning. The rest of us simply stood by dumbfounded and watched as he was forcibly dragged into the well, inch by inch. When it was clear that the men could do nothing more, they let go and took a few steps back. Their entire arms were covered in blood to the elbow. For a moment, nothing happened. Nothing said a word, moved a muscle, did anything. We all just faced the wall and tried our best to process what had just happened. It didn't last long. The well began to gurgle and bubble as though it were digesting my friend. It began to overflow, slow and thick crimson liquid oozing over the top of the well and onto the cold stone floor beneath, making its way towards us. I was the first to move. I stood up and began to slowly step backwards towards the ladder. That's when the massacre began. In an instant, all hell erupted around us. The same arms that had dragged my friend to a then unknown fate sprang out of the walls around us as the island became alive and began to frantically swing around, searching for bodies to claim. A few of them found their mark and pulled some of the men towards the walls, wrapping themselves around their necks and locking them in place and suffocating them. Any sense of composure our toughest men had remaining left their bodies that very moment, and we all made a mad dash for the ladder. The room was only dimly lit by all our flashlights, though. When we broke our formation and began to run, our visibility became significantly limited. Bodies ran into each other, and men began slipping on blood that now reached for their feet. The fog had all begun rising in intensity at a startling rate, and was now almost as thick and copious as it was out on the sea. This made it all the more hard to tell what exactly was happening, and before I knew it, I was knocked onto my ass by one of the Canadians as he ran straight into me. The blood rose higher and higher at an inconceivably fast rate. It was halfway up my knees by the time I regained my footing. When I did, I felt a sudden rush of movement brush past my leg. That's when I saw it. There were shapes moving in the blood, large, serpentine-like shapes that slithered all around us and began to quickly encircle my team. Like sharks, they enveloped us, poised for the kill. They seemed to be probing us for weaknesses, waiting for the exact right moment to strike and take as many of us down as they could. I wasn't gonna let them get me. My body moved independent of my paralysis psyche as I sprinted for the ladder and reached as high as I could to escape the cavern. However, the ladder was barely wide enough to fit one man on it. It was made of wood and was not meant to support the weight of more than a couple of men at a time. I remember just how careful we had to scale it just to get down to the cursed room in the first place. I worried it was going to give way any second, and I'd be stranded in that room with those things, with the well. I felt it crack and buckle beneath me as more men than intended all tried to climb it at once. I pushed into the men above me just as the person did below me, all in a desperate race to escape. Just when I was sure all was lost and I'd never make it out, I reached the top and rolled onto my back. As I did, I heard a loud snapping sound, followed by 8 loud splashes hitting the liquid below. I rolled over and shined my flashlight down the hole to look at the scene and try to help some of the men escape what would now become a tomb. It was no use, though. It was 20 feet down. I couldn't reach any of them. Weathers, McKinney, they stared up at me and shouted for help, but what was I supposed to do? The blood had risen to above their waistbands by that point, and there was more of those fucking things circling them. They climbed over one another in a desperate attempt to get enough height to reach the exit, but I was nowhere near enough. I felt so helpless. I watched the mysterious shapes and figures in the blood creep up to them from behind. Then, as if coordinated, in an instant, they pounced and dragged 3 men under the murky depths at once. In that split second, when they had leapt from the pool to attack the men, I caught only the faintest glimpse of their true form. They were like eels or leeches with spider legs and beaks. Something of that family, but it's still not an accurate comparison. They were truly otherworldly, inhuman, even to creation itself. They were abominations that I'm glad they were obscured by the fog, as to have glanced upon them in all their unholiness would have been too much for me at that moment. They yanked the men down into that ocean of blood. As they did so, the men thrashed around chaotically and knocked more men over, making the already futile pyramid of terrified men all the more pitiful.
That's when I noticed the 3 that were taken by those serpents were being dragged towards the well. They were being dragged to the well so it could devour them, just like Goff had been taken away to that unspeakable fate. I looked at the edge of the room to search for the first victim of the attack, the one who had been forcibly dragged towards the well by the arm. When I found them, I felt my stomach churn once again. Their bodies were halfway into the cavern walls. Their arms were dragging the men head first into the island itself to be consumed. It was as though the island was alive, the well was alive, and it wanted us dead. The remaining few screamed and pleaded and begged for me to help them. All I could do was stare down at the chaos before me and watch. I was ripped out of my comatose state by a firm hand on my shoulder. It was Hawks. "Get up. We gotta get out of here." He picked me up by the back of my shirt and dragged me to my feet, pushing me up the staircase. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. My body was truly on autopilot. I couldn't think of anything other than the men we were leaving behind, and the looks I saw on the faces of those men as they screamed at me for help. The fog had now completely engulfed the inside of the fort, and I struggled to maintain my footing as I ran as fast as I could through the first chamber and up the staircase. As we exited the main door, I was stopped dead in my tracks. I heard gunshots behind me. By God, they were still alive. They were still fighting to get out, and I was abandoning them. Hawks once again yanked me by the back of the shirt as he went past, encouraging me onward. "There's nothing we can do for 'em. We gotta get to the boats now." And with that, he ran off ahead of me through the red smoke. Every fiber of my being compelled me to go back, but my body refused to obey. I just stood there trembling, white knuckles grasping my rifle as I struggled to make a choice. After a few agonizing seconds of contemplation, I followed after Hawks and made my way to the boat, to freedom. As we sped away from the island, I was able to slowly creep back to the real world mentally and finally take note of my surroundings. It was me, Hawks, and 3 other British troops. Only 5 men had made it out. None of us said a word. We all just kept to ourselves and stared off into space, doing our best to process what had happened. I looked back at Fort Ond one last time before it disappeared over the horizon. The fog had grown larger now, redder, hungrier. When we got back to the destroyer, we told command everything that we had seen and what had happened. They didn't believe a word of it. I can't really say as I blame them. We must have sounded insane. Showing up, missing 30 men, covered head to toe in blood, rambling about a mysterious well, our friends being dragged away by an unknown creature to an unknown fate, ancient bronze doors, and slaughtered Nazi soldiers. They told us that we had most likely been exposed to nerve gas, that the base was being classified as a possible chemical weapons lab, and that when we inhaled the fog, maybe we were subjected to hallucinations. But we were sealed up head to toe. We stood up for ourselves as best we could. We all corroborated each other's stories and validated each other's testimonies. We swore up and down till we were blue in the face that the island was not what they thought it was, that our friends had been killed by an unknown force, and that we had to destroy the fort. They just stared at us like we were a pack of lunatics. They had made up their minds about what had happened to us on the island. Any attempts made by any of us to get the record straight only served to make us look even more insane. I turned to one of the admirals and spoke up one last time. I had to know something before they turned us away. "Please tell me you guys are gonna level that place." He stared at me for a few tense seconds before simply saying, "We'll handle it." And with that, it was over. All the remaining members of Operation Maelstrom were discharged the next day, deemed medically unfit to continue service. Each of us was briefed individually on the events of that night, and I was told not to utter a word to anyone about the events of Operation Maelstrom, or to disclose the fort's location to anyone. The colonel who was briefing me told me, "For the record, I believe there's at least a little truth to what you told us. But regardless, you and the survivors are a liability now, unstable and erratic. We can't risk putting any of you onto another operation, not after what happened to you. Or at least, not after what you think happened to you. I'm sorry, but this is for your own good." I was put on a plane the next day and sent home. That's it. You don't believe a word of what I just said to you, do you?
Well, no, not all of it. I mean, I want to, but it's a little much to
I know how it sounds. You think I don't hear myself saying this shit to you? I know how it must sound, but it's true, son. The well is real. What happened to me was real.
Look, I'm sure it must have felt that way, Dad, but you have to...
You don't believe a word of it. Nobody does. You, the doctors, every other person I've confided in just thinks I'm a lunatic who imagined all of this. I see the way you're looking at me, like I'm just a poor old man who's losing his mind. I know what I saw. I know what I went through. You weren't there.
I know I wasn't. I'm not saying I was, Dad, but come on, work with me. Isn't it possible it was a nerve agent or something? How the hell would you know it wasn't?
'Cause we all saw the same damn thing. All the survivors of Maelstrom gave the exact same testimony upon our return. Everything from our encounter with the fog to our return to the ship was synced up perfectly. What do you think, we all hallucinated the same thing?
No, I just think maybe...
You know, they took the books that Captain Hawks acquired. Oh yeah, they made sure we kept nothing from our mission, stripped us bare right after we returned to the ship, but told me what he saw in those pages. More of those strange symbols, those hieroglyphics of unknown origin, the mention of Torzur Hole, some kind of portal to hell or somewhere worse or God knows where. You want to know why I can't sleep at night, Patrick? The real reason is 'cause I know it's still there. We'll handle it, they said. Yeah, like hell they did. They probably just set up shop themselves and tried finishing what the Kraut started. Or maybe not. Maybe they heard our warnings and listened to us. Maybe they shelled the place into oblivion and actually did handle it. But I'll never know, son. I'll never get my closure on the events of what happened that night. I'll never get to know with 100% certainty that the well has been sealed and that whatever lies in the depths of Fort Ond can't get me anymore.
Let's just take some deep breaths, okay? Why don't you just calm down and...
This was a waste of time. It always is with people like you.
Dad, come on, please.
We're done here. Turn that damn thing off and get...
The tape ends there. I couldn't find any additional tapes in my father's belongings, so for the time being, that's where the story ends. I didn't know my grandpa too well. He died when I was 12 and was reclusive. Sadly, this tape is one of the only glimpses I've gotten into his life. I don't know what to believe. It's easy to write him off as crazy or the victim of a gas attack, but the fear I heard on that tape sounded way too real. It's gotta mean something, right? If nothing else, the torment he endured was real, and maybe that's all that matters. Or maybe, just maybe, he's right. Maybe Fort Ond still stands, exactly as he described, hidden somewhere behind the veil of fog. I've always been passionate about exploring caves and tombs, particularly those that are uncharted and mysterious.
The thrill of venturing into these deep, dark spaces where few dare to tread is something that never fails to excite me. Even when faced with the most perilous and deadly caves, I remain undeterred by the danger, embracing the adrenaline rush to the fullest. Despite being well equipped and prepared for an expedition, there were moments where I feared for my life and believed that my time might be up. I even left farewell messages on my phone for my family, knowing that I had no children to worry about leaving behind as a father and no teammates to slow me down on this solo cave exploration. Today, I stumbled across the most thrilling tomb I've ever encountered. It remains unexplored by anyone else, so I'm eager to be the first to explore and document the incredible findings awaiting within. I spent 3 months getting ready for my next dive, feeling both excited and nervous about what I might find. In a remote area of the earth, I stumbled upon something hidden deep underground within a cave system far away from civilization. This cave was unique, with a vertical and damp structure that required the use of ropes for navigation. As I descended down the shaft, I came across the entrance to the tomb, adorned with what looked like an image of a mysterious religious figure, covered in robes and being carried to an unknown destination. The rest of the decorations were obscured by dust, and it was only during my second dive that I noticed them. Lucky for me, I had my phone to capture photos of the decorations, for mapping purposes, before proceeding any further. Additionally, I had a torch and a spare flashlight, with various gear to illuminate my path as I went deeper into the darkness. As I descended the stairs, I observed the walls and brick structures, unsure which historical era that brick reminded me of. Upon entering the initial room, I noticed dusty murals adorned the walls, alongside empty torches, with the murals written in ancient Latin, a language I'd studied during my adventures in exploring. The initial mural displayed the following message: "This is not a place where riches or devotion can be found, but a prison filled with the specter of death. Retreat now, or face an endless torment." The text sent chills running down my back. It was unlike any tomb I had ever been in before, but my curiosity pushed me to delve deeper. I snapped a few pics and studied the second mural. The message on the second one was written like this: "This prison that we have built is meant to be untouched and undisturbed. It should be left behind, forgotten forever. May God protect us from him." I found myself pondering, may God protect us from him. It was evident that this location did not appreciate intrusion. Despite contemplating a retreat, the rush of adrenaline I experienced was unlike anything I had felt before. Against my better instincts, I decided to press on. The mural room opened up to a staircase that descended even further, prompting me to ponder just how far down it went. The sound of my footsteps reverberated through the empty staircase, indicating that the descent went on for quite a distance. Eventually, the stairs came to an end, revealing a massive room adorned with various artworks. "This find is the most incredible find of the era," I said out loud. The walls of the room were adorned with artwork, expanding upward and upward for a minimum of 30 meters. One particular detail caught my eye. Could these artistic walls be serving as a guidance or direction? Possibly for individuals like me who had overlooked the murals and continued exploring anyway. The main focus of the artwork was on a gathering of individuals dressed in unfamiliar attire, worshipping an altar emanating a dark gas that contained eerie faces showing a range of emotions from delight to fear. I noticed and observed the man laying on the altar, black gas escaping from his chest. Despite his efforts to contain the cloud with his hands, it was unsuccessful. As I was busy capturing multiple photos of the artwork from different angles, I suddenly heard a low growl emanating from several directions. I heard the sound of large stones rumbling, which indicated to me that it was time to quickly make a retreat. Having captured photographs and explored to a satisfying extent, I planned on returning at a later time. Unfortunately, while I was rushing up the stairs, I narrowly escaped death when a massive rock almost hit me in the head. I quickly ran back down the stairs when the way ahead to the entrance was completely blocked by an enormous boulder. It was a dreadful situation, far worse than any cave mishap I had encountered before. There seemed to be no escape, and my mind immediately turned to thoughts of my family, my friends, my past cave expeditions. Surprisingly, I found myself thinking about exploring again. Despite feeling scared and vulnerable, I realized I should have been better prepared with the right gear. By then, it was already too late, though. It was as if the cave was beckoning me further in, though, enticing me to continue exploring. I was trying to go home, but I realized I was unable to leave. The tomb had summoned me, and I had no choice but to go on. As I made my way to the art room, I wished and hoped for a different way out, when all of a sudden my torch died, enveloping me in total darkness, causing me to trip and scatter the contents of my bag everywhere. As my hands groped for my spare flashlight, I was startled by the sound of singing emanating from the shadows, singing a language that seemed unearthly and ancient to me. In a state of panic, I unintentionally kicked various objects into the darkness, including my flashlight, which I inadvertently switched on. Frantically searching for the flashlight, I began to see faces emerging from the shadows. The volume of singing increased. The faces in the shadows began to smile at me. But as soon as I switched on the flashlight, everything came to an abrupt halt. My heart was racing uncontrollably. I needed to pause and collect myself for a moment, and after gathering my gear, I proceeded to venture deeper into the tomb. As I'd injured my leg by accidentally kicking my gear, I was unable to run and had to take slower steps while passing through the next chamber. There was a lot of artwork that caught my attention, and I quickly snapped photos to study later. One piece in particular depicted the man from earlier on the altar, standing amidst the eerie black smoke and terrifying faces. Another showed the figures from earlier paintings, lifeless, engulfed in the black smoke seeping into their wounds. Besides this room, there was another chamber where sculptures of deceased individuals with horrifying expressions were positioned, all of them appearing to bow down to the man wearing a crown made out of human skin on the altar. I didn't even think about capturing this moment on my phone. I was more focused on finding the exit. Another set of stairs descended further into the darkness, my legs refusing to move. I was consumed by terror, a sensation of an otherworldly presence emanating from below, followed by the resumption of eerie singing, which spurred me to glance backwards, only to find nothing in sight. Out of nowhere, my legs collapsed, causing me to tumble down the stairs, leaving me covered in bruises and injuries, and I had no strength to stand back up. What I witnessed came close to stealing everything I had. I found myself in the grand altar room, which was adorned with towering pillars and statues of deceased individuals. The torches cast a dim light, despite the flames burning black. Sunlight was pouring through the broken gap in the wall of the room, providing me with a potential escape route. In my frantic rush to depart, I overlooked or possibly ignored the figure lying on the altar. The individual depicted in the paintings and the artwork appeared in a distorted position with dark gas enveloping his mouth and chest, giving him a zombified and paralyzed appearance that deviated from his usual depiction. Stupidly, I began moving on my hands towards the sunlight, because my legs were frozen. Upon awakening, the corpse-like man's lifeless fingers began to move, while dark gas slowly escaped from his mouth. I screamed and hurriedly crawled towards the opening, making sure to keep my phone in my pocket while abandoning the bag and my flashlight to lessen the burden, relying solely on the lights of the torches and the sunlight to guide me. I turned around and saw the man standing there, with frothy gas coming out of his mouth. Inside him, there were more faces that seemed to be singing a melodious tune, urging me not to leave. I made a conscious effort to ignore them. Out of nowhere, the man began running towards me at an incomprehensible pace, with dark fog foaming out of his mouth and revealing sinister faces, embodying pure evil. He jumped at me and seized my legs, dragging me towards the altar. I kicked and kicked with all my might, with my now unparalyzed legs, but my efforts were in vain. Desperately, I clawed at the loose dirt, yearning for the sun. The man exerted more force, causing several bones in my leg to break completely. I yelled until my voice was hoarse, yet I managed to hold firm to the ground. I was on the brink of freedom, yet it was so far when I chose to kick once more, this time connecting with his deteriorating face, causing him to release his grip on me. With my fingers outstretched, I took one last attempt to reach the warm sunlight, but I fell short of escaping through the hole. The man from the altar attempted to jump towards me again, but he inadvertently came in contact with the sunlight, causing him to recoil. I witnessed his body beginning to disintegrate as soon as the sun's rays made contact. I saw an opportunity and quickly seized it as my fingers clutched onto the damaged stonework. I jumped outside through the hole, which revealed a staircase going up. As a large stone door started to close slowly behind me, I turned around and observed the man still melting, emanating black smoke from newly formed holes. He melted into a liquid, a dark vapor within him, starting to vanish upon contact with the sun. It seemed as though a divine intervention had rescued me from the terrifying entity. After I managed to emerge from the stairway, I found myself surrounded by dense woods, yet I could make out a village not too far away. I wondered how far the tomb had transported me. Despite having only 6% battery life left and being stranded, I was fortunate enough to still have service. I managed to drag myself to the nearby village where I was able to call an ambulance, though it was a painful journey. Unfortunately, I suffered irreparable damage to my leg, leaving me disabled for the rest of my life. However, the important thing was that I survived. I no longer felt the desire to explore caves or engage in thrilling activities. Seemed like a piece of my soul was lost that day, resting in the tomb alongside the eerie gas and the altar man's dark intentions. If you come across that tomb in the future, do yourself a favor and leave it alone. There is no hidden treasure or religious significance to be found there. It's a prison that should be left undisturbed for all eternity. There's nothing to do in my town. If the internet had never been invented, I would have gotten stuck hanging out at the local coffee shop, desperate to fill my time. I have access to unlimited entertainment and information at my fingertips, and yet I still can't find answers about what happened last summer. I'm more of an indoor person. Somehow, my friend Kenny dragged me along on a camping trip with his brother and his childhood friend. We all grew up together. Kenny's brother was 2 years older, so it felt like we never really connected. I didn't dislike him, we just never had anything in common. My best friend was the prettiest girl in the county, and I think she knew it. I had been in love with her since I was 13, but I'd never admitted it to her. I know the moment I did, our relationship would change. I was scared she might reject my feelings or accept them. Just being friends suited me just fine. The only way to get me outside was if Mia was going to be there. I think Kenny and Darren knew that. If I refused to go on the camping trip, they asked Mia to come along, and they told me she would be with us. I hated how easily they played me. It was a hot day. All of us were sweating by the time we arrived at the campsite. "Can we set up the tent after?" Kenny said, as he let the bags drop from his shoulders. "No, let's get it done now, or else we won't get it done in time," I told him, no matter how much I wanted to put it off. I knew him. The last trip he and his brother took, they were too lazy to set up the tent and just slept outside in their sleeping bags. They came back home covered in bug bites. I didn't want a repeat of that. They both groaned, but they listened to me. Mia and I worked on one tent while the brothers set up the other. There are only 2 tents, I pointed out. We've shared tents before, she replied, not looking up. If she had, she would have seen how red my face had got. At least, I could blame the sunny weather for my flushed cheeks. Kenny decided to toss a full water bottle at Darren, but missed. It hit me upside the back of the head, and I needed to go over then and roughhouse for a little bit. Mia crossed her arms, amused by us. I got my butt handed to me, like always. As I got back up off the ground from the play fight, I noticed something white flash between the trees. I was about to mention it, but the color was gone as fast as I noticed it. We had picked a campsite that wasn't that popular with the locals, but that didn't mean there wasn't anyone else in the woods. We finally got the campsite set up, tents ready, food put away in case any animals, and the firewood gathered. Once that was all set, we started to head down the path that led to the lake. We all had earned a long swim. Kenny and Darren walked ahead of us, and I helped Mia down the rough pathway. "Should we really be camping right now?" Mia asked, loud enough for Kenny to hear. "Wasn't there a big search recently?" I'd heard a little about that. Kenny chimed in to explain what had happened. 4 campers high on shrooms walked into the woods, and no one found any trace of them. That was 3 weeks ago, so I don't think we'll come across any feral lost campers, he said with a shrug. It was a bit heartless to imply those 4 were dead, but he was right. Those 4 didn't have a good chance of being around after dealing with that summer's heat for 3 weeks. "Just in case, let's not go out in the woods alone," I told him, suddenly feeling a chill, even though I was sweating. "Is that your fetish? You like to watch us pee?" Kenny teased. "I think it's number 2s. No free shows," Darren added. "Kinda weird how fast you guys thought of that. Almost like it was on your mind," I replied. I've dealt with these guys for years. I expected the dumbest thing to come out of their mouths. Mia giggled at us, and I wondered why she put up with these morons. The lake wasn't as cold as I had hoped. The water was nice, and it did help with the heat, but I almost wished I was at home with the AC on full blast. When I saw Mia in her black one-piece swimsuit and trunks, the thought of AC went out of my mind. I kept forcing my eyes away from her, so she didn't know how much of a creep I was. I really needed to get a grip on myself, though. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked Kenny when he swam over to me. He wrapped an arm around my neck and playfully drugged me under, but stopped when I spoke up. He followed my line of sight into the woods, trying to spot what I was staring at. "Is that a person?" he asked, squinting. Soon, Darren and Mia were looking in the same direction. A white shape was between 2 trees on the other side of the lake. It didn't look like a person, but it was impossible to tell at that distance. It was too still to be a person, yet it didn't sway in the breeze as if it was a discarded shirt or some trash. "Let's go see," Kenny said, as he let go of my neck. He started to swim away, and Mia came up next to me. "What do you think it is?" she asked. When I'd taken my eyes off the tree and to her, the white object moved. Kenny stopped swimming when he realized what he'd been looking at was gone. "Probably some old pervert watching a tasty little thing swim around shirtless," Kenny said with a splash. "He's implying the old pervert is watching you," Derek finished with a smile. I slapped water in his face. Soon the white shape had been forgotten as we got into a water fight. I kept glancing back into the trees. The white shape didn't return, and I assumed it had been nothing after all. We started heading back to the campsite when the sky started to turn orange. Kenny and Darren chatted the entire way back about the beans they were going to cook and eat. I was glad I was not sharing a tent with them tonight. When we did get back, they discovered that somehow they left the bag that held the coveted beans back in the truck. Mia had also forgot a few things, so she went back with them. I didn't feel like walking, so I volunteered to stay behind and get the fire started. They'd been gone about 5 minutes when I heard Kenny's voice again off in the distance. Oddly enough, it wasn't in the direction they left in. "You forget something?" I called out. His voice came again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the direction of the lake, but He would have needed to walk through the campsite to be on that path. I stood up, straining to listen, calling out his name as I took a few steps closer to the path heading to the lake. "Kenny, stop fooling around," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Did he take the long way around just to scare me? No, he hadn't been gone that long for him to be that far out. I took another step closer, but stopped. This felt wrong. After those 4 people got lost in the woods, I decided I didn't want to go down a path alone. I went back to setting up the fire and getting dinner ready. If Kenny was playing a prank, then he would get bored and come back. Oddly enough, my 3 friends came back together. "Did you see any other cars around?" I asked, wondering if they had just been another camper out there that sounded like Kenny. "No, it's just us. Why?" Mia asked, catching on that something was bothering me. "I heard something while you guys were out. It sounded like a human, but it's hard to say." Now I was doubting myself, but that really sounded like a voice. Or was it just too far away to tell? "Probably a bird. Some of those loons or whatever they're called sound spooky," Darren said with a shrug. He went out camping here pretty often. I accepted that he knew what he was talking about and dismissed my concern. We settled down to eat. The brothers gladly ate cans of beans as Mia and I stuck to our hot dogs. The brothers also lit up an after-dinner treat. I didn't smoke, but Mia did on occasions. She passed that night. I think she didn't want to bring the smell into the shared tent. Kenny stood up to say he needed to use the washroom. It had gotten dark, so I found him a flashlight. I also needed to go. Then Darren stood up, deciding that he should go with us. And Mia didn't want to be left alone, so we all gathered for a bathroom break. It was a bit hard to focus on the task at hand, knowing Mia was so close by. I knew she had her back turned to the 3 of us as we took care of business, yet it still took me the longest to finish. We scouted a good spot for her and gave Mia some privacy, but also kept scanning the trees in case a wild animal decided to suddenly appear. With all that taken care of, we were going to head back when an unnatural sound came from nearby. Something I never expected to ever hear while in the forest at night. A few feet away from us came the sound of a baby crying. I saw Kenny's pale face in the light of my flashlight. Darren silently shook his head as Mia stood frozen in place. I took a step closer to the source of the noise, and Darren's hand fell on my shoulder. "To hell with that," he whispered. I agreed and took a step back. We should all just leave. Mia, bless her, didn't want to risk someone actually being in trouble. She bravely marched off into the woods with 3 guys going after her, whispering for us to get out of there. We followed the source of the sound. She stopped just outside a small clearing with someone sitting on a log. They were dressed in rags with their back facing us. The figure hunched over, rocking back and forth as they made shushing sounds. We didn't hear the baby crying anymore. This was freaky, downright nightmare fuel. "Are you okay?" Mia asked in a shaky voice. "My baby, my poor baby," the woman spoke, and she sounded so normal compared to how she looked. "We can call someone to get you some help," Mia offered. "My poor baby is starving." Slowly, the figure turned its head. The light caught a set of gray eyes that reflected in the flashlight. Stringy gray hair fell over her pale face. At first, the expression was blank. Then the face transformed into something distorted and monstrous. Kenny and Darren were screaming before the creature stood up. They bolted, leaving Mia and me behind. I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to run as the pale creature screeched. It got on all fours to easily cross the clearing to reach us. It jumped into the air, mouth open and bony, clawed hands outstretched. I pulled Mia out of the way just in time. The creature crashed into a tree, then flipped around on the ground like a cat trying to right itself. We started running again. Mia's legs shook so much I ended up grabbing her around the waist to just drag her along behind me. To my horror, the monster kept coming for us. I needed to fight back. I let go of her long enough to find a hefty stick to use as a weapon. That was a mistake, although I'm not sure if we had any chance of getting away unscathed. The pale creature came down on Mia, biting down on her hand. She screamed and kicked to get the thing away from her. I slammed the branch as hard as I could on the monster's face. It screeched and released my best friend. I kept hitting it, but I think I was just pissing it off. Just as it was about to go into a counterattack, a whistle came from somewhere. For some reason, the creature suddenly got on all fours, a look of distress on its face. It turned tail and darted back into the woods. To my horror, I saw another pale figure between the trees also take off running on all fours. I didn't care about the reason why they were leaving, only that we were safe for now. "How bad is it?" I said to Mia, turning all my attention on her. She shook her head with tears in her eyes. The bite wasn't as deep as I had thought. We had a first aid kit at camp. I took hold of her again and got us moving. I didn't hear Kenny or Darren, even though they left us behind. I hoped they were safe. "It'll be all right. We'll get out of here. Do you have your phone?" I asked as we kept moving. She shook her head. I hadn't grabbed mine either. Sure, we were smart enough to go in a group, but we hadn't done anything intelligent after that. An odd whistling sound came through the trees. The strange melody chilled me to the core. Mia started to tug at my arm as we walked away from the whistling. I glanced over her shoulder and saw flashes of white darting around the branches above us. As much as I hated the whistling, going in that direction seemed like the better option. Mia protested a little when I pulled on her arm to get moving. I didn't want to scare her by telling her that the creatures were stalking us in the trees. When I heard Kenny scream, I forgot about the threat we faced and ran in his direction. Hearing his voice was a good sign. I just hope we got to him in time. We stumbled into another clearing. I raised the flashlight I somehow still had. The beam of light landed on a stranger's face. His left eye reflected the light, but his right eye didn't. His head was slightly tilted, as if amused by my sudden appearance. My skin crawled, seeing such a pleased face after a terrifying encounter beforehand. Kenny was on the ground, breathing heavily, with the man's foot on his chest. He also had a bite taken out of his arm that was freely bleeding. For a moment, it appeared he had a crossbow bolt sticking out of his chest. I soon realized the bolt was stuck inside a pale monster beside him. I didn't see it first. The stranger had a hunter's bow attached to his arm, loaded and ready to shoot. "What did you do to Kenny, and where's Darren?" I demanded with a trembling voice. The man licked his lips and lifted his foot off of Kenny's chest. He brushed the strands of dirty brown hair from his face, only to have it fall back down. "I just saved this one from being a midnight snack, and I sent the other one down the trail. He might not reach the end alone, though," the stranger said, ending his sentence with a raspy laugh. He sounded as if he smoked a pack a day for most of his life. I didn't trust the guy. Mia tightened her grip on my arm, showing she felt the same way. "Two of you got bitten tonight. Bites can turn people into those things. The infected ones won't be able to stand the whistling." After the man spoke, he started whistling in a way that didn't sound human. It was as if a songbird was trying to imitate a man-made instrument. I hadn't been bitten that night, yet the noise put me on edge. Kenny recovered enough to scramble away from the stranger. Mia didn't react, aside from appearing as nervous as she did when she first stumbled onto the scene. Finally, the man finished whistling and then studied us all very carefully. He raised the crossbow and rested it against his shoulder. "The trail is just past those two trees. You kids better get going." A weight had been lifted off my chest. Aside from some minor injuries and a few scars, we were free to leave. Kenny was the first to get up. His legs shook as he tried to walk towards where we had been directed. Mia and I walked past the man, feeling his eyes on us. All the stress from the night came back as he gave us his unseen, judging stare. I thought we were in the clear when a sharp whistle came again. It was sudden, and I jumped. Mia did as well. I turned around to comfort her, and what I saw caused my entire world to come crumbling down. Her face changed. The person I'd cared for so deeply and for so long looked nothing like her. In her shock, she dropped her mask to let a contorted version of herself show through. When she realized her cover had been blown, her mouth grew wide and was suddenly filled with countless sharp teeth. She wanted to take my head off, but a quick shot from the crossbow stopped her. A bolt went through her cheek, shattering her teeth. She screamed, thrashing around, before the man shot her again. She ripped the bolt from her face and jumped backwards. Mia landed on all fours, snarling with a blood-filled mouth. To my horror, a ripping sound came as she sprouted massive bat wings. Her hands became claws, and her face transformed into something so far from human that I almost doubted she had once been the friend I cared for. In a flash, she launched herself into the treetops, joining the other white creatures that watched the scene at a distance. It took me a long time to realize the stranger started to drag me away. My brain was so numb from the shock, I didn't remember how long we walked on the trail or what anyone said to me most of the way back. I knew the man was whistling again, and I snapped, wanting the noise to end. He stopped for a few minutes, then I realized the noise was the only thing keeping the creatures away. He playfully started back up again as Kenny and I kept our heads forward, trying to ignore the horrors in the trees. Darren was waiting for us at the end of the trail at the outside of the woods. A lone police officer stood next to him, face as cold as steel. We stopped in front of them, unsure of what to say or how to explain ourselves. "Did you take care of the problem?" the officer said, sounding annoyed. "Problems? And nope, too many of them to deal with, and get these three out at the same time. I'm going back in to see what I can do. Sure do wish I had a friend to come along with me," the stranger said, with a loud and exasperated sigh. I found my mouth opening to offer to go back and save Mia, but the cop stopped me. He saw 3 scared kids who would die if they tried to fight some monsters in the dark woods. "None of that. This is your job. Now go do it while I take care of my duties." The man shrugged again and pulled something out of his pocket. I expected it to be a pack of cigarettes, but he opened a small jar of dried cinnamon sticks. He tried to offer one to Kenny, who refused. I reached out and took one, not to start chewing on it like he did, but I needed something real from that night or else my brain wouldn't believe it had happened. "This one's bit. Do you have anything for him?" the officer asked, and the stranger shook his head. Without warning, the cop pulled out a package of syringes with some sort of clear mystery fluid inside. Kenny didn't protest the shot. The officer then reached into his back pocket and pulled out 3 folded pieces of paper. "Sign these statements. The story is your friend got up in the middle of the night and got lost. We'll search for her tomorrow," the cop said and handed us a sheet of paper. Darren looked disgusted, but he signed his name. Kenny needed some prodding to do the same. I refused, and it made the officer glower in my direction. "What if I tell a different story?" I threatened, ready to face whatever retaliation might happen. "You can. I say it would be better for you mentally to get the story out, but no one will believe you. As it is, people will assume you did something to that girl. Don't make it harder on yourself," the stranger said, as he rolled the cinnamon stick between his teeth. I hated him. I hated myself, and I hated what had happened. I signed the paper, and the officer told us to get in the car so he could take us to the station. He made us repeat the same fake story a few dozen times. As we drove off, I looked out the back window to see the stranger giving us a sarcastic wave, and I saw the lights of the car being reflected by so many eyes watching in the trees. There was a search for Mia, but nothing turned up. People have whispered about what happened. None of it's even close to the truth. Kenny and Darren started to stay inside and away from accusing stares. I've heard they're not as close as they were before. I've started saving up as much as I can to move away. There's nothing left for me in this place except bad memories. I don't know if that man hunted down all the monsters lurking in the woods, and deep down, I hope he didn't kill the thing that Mia turned into. Twisted or not, I wanted a part of her to live on, no matter how selfish that was. I need to leave this place. I found myself wanting to go back to those woods and try to find her, and that desire scares me. The real Mia would want me to live, and that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm a little surprised that I'm writing this, since I was never that much into the supernatural. I say not that much because my older sister, Rita, was mesmerized by it. She was 6 years older than me. So most of what she did with her friends in the attic of our garage was a mystery. The garage attic was strictly off limits. They guarded it like an inner sanctum. It wasn't until my mother discovered the Ouija board that I began to understand that something was amiss. We weren't particularly religious, but we did attend church on holidays. My mother went on a tirade when my father got home from work, insisting that my sister was inviting evil spirits into our house. My dad threw out the Ouija board, and later, I picked it up out of the trash and used it for target practice with my brother's BB gun. None of that would have been particularly memorable, except the following night, my sister was babysitting me. Normally, as soon as my parents left, they would call Brenda down the street to come down and split the babysitting money with her and leave. I didn't complain since Brenda was much more interested in my stories than my sister and her friends, but tonight, my sister stayed home and invited her friend Angie over. They told me to stay in my parents' room as they disappeared into the basement. I grew up in the Midwest, and we had one of those old, deep basements. The house was over 100 years old, and the basement was a place that I can only remember visiting maybe once or twice when I dropped some toys into the heating vent, and my dad had to go into the basement and disconnect some ductwork. There were only 2 small windows that were barely large enough for a child to fit through, but way too small for an adult. I remember there was a cold draft, too. There was a brick wall that butted up to the stairs, leading down to the basement that had partially collapsed. I remember looking into that darkness and asking my dad where it led, and he said it led beneath the house. My parents never had to tell me not to go into the basement. I was petrified of it. I think I was playing with toy soldiers in my parents' room when I heard their blood-curdling screams. I don't remember being afraid, but they both came running up the basement stairs and ran straight past me out of the house, slamming the basement door behind them. I was 7 years old at the time. I had no idea why I didn't follow them. I just sat there on the floor with my toy soldiers. And then I heard the footsteps. I thought maybe it was one of my older brothers, Joey, who was down the street playing guitar with his friend Steven. They were always playing pranks. The door to the basement was locked. I could hear the door being pushed. The lock was just a wooden disc my dad had made. When they slammed the door, it had fallen down and locked. I heard it hit the floor when the door burst open. And that's about all I remember. I woke up the next day in the hospital. Later I was told that my sister had run down the street to get my brother, and they said they'd found me unconscious on the floor. The doctor said I'd had a convulsion. That's what I believed for 13 years, at least until last night. My sister Rita went on to become a flight attendant, and my brother Joey, I still call him that, became a DNR officer. We love each other dearly, but because I live on the other side of the country, we don't stay in touch as much as we used to. At least we don't as often as when I was living in Michigan. I'd flown back from my father's funeral, and we were all reminiscing on my parents' porch. That's when my brother Joey brought up the night that I'd had the convulsion. He made us swear to never tell you the truth, Joey said, taking a long drag off his cigarette. But now that he's gone, I guess we can tell you what really happened. I looked over at Rita, thinking this might be a joke, but the look of dread on her face told me that whatever Joey was about to say was not for my amusement. "You sure this is a good idea?" she said nervously. Joey crushed his cigarette out on the wooden bench. "You didn't have a convulsion." Joey leaned in, the flicker of the porch light casting shadows across his face, making him look more solemn than usual. "What happened to you that night wasn't anything medical." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to tell me what had happened. When Rita and I got back to the house, we found Something with you. Joey glanced at Rita, and as if on cue, she said, It wasn't human. My mind went to the rational explanation of a rabid dog or maybe a feral raccoon. They both laughed when I asked if it was an animal. So what was it? I said. It was like a shadow, and it was floating above you, Rita said, her voice barely audible. I laughed and got up to go back inside. I don't believe in ghosts, I said. Wasn't no fucking ghost, Joey said, unbuttoning his shirt and showing me a scar on his chest. You got that when you fell out of a tree, I replied. I remember you telling me. No, it's a story we made up. You did that to me, he said, tapping out another cigarette. Nothing in their demeanors suggested this was a prank, but perhaps I'd underestimated their acting skills. I was 7 years old. There's no way It went inside you, Joey said. He looked over at Rita, who finished his sentence. It possessed you. I know that sounds horrible, but it wasn't your fault. This had better be a hidden camera prank, I said, looking around. You picked me up in the air like I was a twig and threw me across the room. Then you started speaking in some crazy language, Joey said. It was my fault, Rita said, her eyes full of tears. Me and Angie asked the spirits to reveal themselves. None of this sparked any memories. How do you know you weren't imagining things? Joey laughed and looked down at his scar as he rebuttoned his shirt. I had trouble sleeping with you in my room for a year after that. You have any idea what it was like keeping that secret? A part of me wondered why they'd decided to break the news to me now. I looked over at Rita, hoping she would start laughing, but she was crying instead. Okay, so you two, saved me from an evil spirit? I asked sarcastically. Joey shook his head. Nah, Mom and Dad came home. My father was not a man prone to superstitions, so I was surprised when Joey decided to bring him into the story. And when he walked in, you started talking that crazy language, and then you started slinging Dad around the room like a wet noodle, he said, lighting a second cigarette. Joey laughed at the thought. I thought you were going to kill him, and that's when Mr. Payne walked in. I remembered Mr. Payne well. He always walked with a limp and was gardening in his backyard. We used to think it was funny that anyone had the last name Payne and that it would be perfect for a dentist, but he was a foreman at a factory. He heard the screams from across the street and came over to see what was wrong. Boy, did he ever get a surprise, Joey said. He was a good man, Rita said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. That thing started talking to him, and Mr. Payne started talking back in the same strange language. Joey was looking off in the distance. There's a lot you don't know about Mr. Payne. I couldn't help but think my siblings had watched The Exorcist one too many times. This is all unbelievable. I'm sorry. Did you know he studied to be a priest for 5 years and then gave it up when he met Mrs. Payne? Joey said, sitting on the porch rail. That's how he could speak to it. He studied those old languages. He started praying over you, and he asked Mom and Dad to get a priest, Rita added. I tried to envision Mr. Payne standing over me in prayer, but I couldn't hold the thought. All sounded so fantastical. There was a whole room full of them praying over you, all night long, Joey said. Every once in a while, we'd hear a ruckus, and Mr. Payne and it would start talking to each other again. I'm so sorry, Rita said, reaching out to grab my hand. I've been wanting to tell you, God, for so long. It was strange, hearing a story about myself that sounded like a fairy tale. I knew the only way to find out if it was true was to ask Mr. Payne myself, but I wasn't even sure he was still alive. Is Mr. Payne still alive? I asked. Yeah, Joey said. He's over at the old folks' home. I saw him there when I went to Dad's birthday party a couple of years ago. I told my brother and sister that it was hard to believe, but if it did happen, I had no memory of it and forgave them for whatever it was worth. Seemed like it was important for them to hear that I forgave them, but it didn't sound like they'd done anything wrong. What I didn't tell them was that I planned to visit Mr. Payne tomorrow before my flight for California. I had a few hours in the morning, and given the circumstances, it seemed like the most rational thing to do. In retrospect, it was obviously not the wisest choice. That night, I sat in my hotel room trying to figure out why my siblings had come up with such a ridiculous story. They were both teenagers, and maybe they had misunderstood the situation. I might have lost my mind temporarily and then had a convulsion. Except the people praying over me all night long didn't seem to fit the story. But it was a small town with plenty of superstitious people. Wouldn't be the first time a group of well-meaning religious folks misdiagnosed a medical condition for a supernatural event. I woke up early the next morning and headed over to the nursing home. The last time I'd been to Hazelbuck Nursing Home was during my childhood. I would visit with my mom when my cousin was living there. My cousin had multiple sclerosis, and I remembered the place smelling bad, like Clorox. My cousin was always in good spirits and smiling, but I could never get over the smell of the place. To my surprise, the place had been completely renovated, and it even smelled better. There was a young lady in the front who greeted me. I asked if Mr. Payne was still a resident, and she asked me to sign in and pointed me towards room 144. I stood outside the room for a few moments. I still had time to turn around and head back to my normal, boring life in California. The radio was on, and I could hear Ernie Harwell doing a play-by-play announcement for the Tigers baseball game. Against my better judgment, I knocked on the door and heard a gruff voice say, "Door's open. Come in." I walked in and saw Mr. Payne sitting in a recliner. He didn't look much different than I remembered him, but I could tell he was having trouble placing me. "It's Rich Thelen. You knew me as Richie," I said, smiling. Mr. Payne's demeanor changed immediately. It was as if he'd seen a ghost. I can come back another time if you..." No, it's fine. I just wasn't expecting to see anyone today." He pushed out a footrest. "Have a seat." I was suddenly uncomfortable. I guess I had half expected Mr. Payne to tell me it was just an overactive imagination, but judging from his reaction, I knew I wasn't going to like what he had to tell me. I thought about standing up and leaving. I'm sure he'd probably wonder why I showed up, but there was some doors that were just best to leave closed. This felt like one of those. "I heard about your dad. You just never know how long you got until the bell tolls." It took me a moment to reorient myself. I'd completely forgotten that I'd been at my dad's funeral yesterday. Yeah, he always said he'd probably die of a heart attack. My grandpa was 45 when he died the same way. "You mean Bill? I knew your grandpa. We used to hunt pheasant together." I didn't remember my grandpa. He died before I was born, so I didn't have anything to add. "I'm really surprised to see you," Mr. Payne said, slapping me on the knee. "You look good." "Thank you," I said, realizing I could just make small talk and leave. I didn't need to open any locked doors. I could just shoot the breeze. "So what brings you here?" Mr. Payne asked. "I came because I heard a crazy story, and I wanted to see if it was true." Mr. Payne ran his fingers through what was left of his gray hair. "I figured that's why you were here." Mr. Payne looked over his shoulder. "Can you get me some water? There's a cup next to the sink." I didn't know if that was a stall tactic or if he was preparing to give me a long speech, but I was happy to stand up and create some space between us. A few minutes later, I turned around with his water, and that's when I noticed he was holding a rosary. I handed him the water, and rather than sit back down, I took a couple of steps and leaned against the counter. "I've tried to forget that night," Mr. Payne said, sipping from the styrofoam cup. "You sure this wasn't just an overactive imagination?" I asked. The old man lifted an eyebrow. "Did they tell you what happened? What they could remember, yeah?" Mr. Payne took a few more sips of water and thought for a long time. "Well, they were just kids, so they probably didn't tell you everything." I waited for him to say something, but he just sat there in silence. I don't think he really wanted to discuss it. "Mr. Payne, my brother said you dropped out of the priesthood." "I did. Mrs. Payne was a nun back then, and I was going to be a priest, but Nature decided otherwise. I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. Again, I contemplated abruptly walking out of the room. What you had in you was an old spirit, very old. It had come across the ocean from the old world, Europe. The language it spoke was Latin. None of this made any sense. Our house was old by the standards of the United States, but there was nothing ancient about it by European standards. Why would an old spirit live in our basement? I asked. Mr. Payne laughed. Is that what they told you, that it was in your basement? I nodded, surprised that there appeared to be a disagreement in their memories. Part of me hoped that the version I was about to hear was tethered in reality. It visited your basement because your sister and her friends called out to it, Mr. Payne said, his hand holding the rosary as it started to shake. I thought back to my brother telling me there was a lot of things I didn't know about Mr. Payne. That was suddenly starting to sound like an understatement. Then where did it come from? I asked. Mr. Payne's gaze went blank, and he started to mumble in a foreign language. That's when his eyes rolled back in his head, and a smile crossed his face. The following words rolled out of his mouth in a thick Italian accent. Venit ex me. A moment later, his whole body began to shake. I pushed the nurse button next to the bed, still grounded in reality. I thought he was having a stroke. He was talking much clearer now, and I tried to remember it. Sponsium cum santa fide. And then I saw it with my own eyes. Black smoke, like tentacles, lifted out of his body and started taking the shape of a human. I was no longer in the nursing home. I was a petrified 7-year-old boy on the floor holding a toy soldier. Everything I had repressed came back in a terrifying moment. The cries, the prayers, and eventually being freed. With the last of his strength, Mr. Payne whispered, Serveti ipsum, serveti ipsum. And a moment later, the shadows enveloped him and vanished. A caregiver eventually arrived a few minutes later. They said he was having one of his episodes and asked if I'd come back another day. I walked out of the nursing home and realized I'd reopened a door that Mr. Payne had locked with great difficulty and sacrificed 30 years ago. I didn't know the specifics of what Mr. Payne had done that night or what had happened in Rome that caused Mr. Payne to leave the priesthood, but something told me it was more than simply meeting his wife. A few months later, I looked up the meaning of those words. Mr. Payne was telling me he'd made a pact with the darkness, and then he told me to save myself. I pray every day to be spared the fate that Mr. Payne had. I also pray for his soul to be released. And perhaps, most importantly, I make sure I keep the basement door well locked.